Now that I'm older, I've learned there's a difference between being forgotten and being left out. The first one is an accident. The second is a choice. And on Thanksgiving Day last year, I learned which one had happened to me. I'm glad you're here. Follow my story until the end, and tell me where you're watching from. Sometimes it helps to know that someone somewhere is listening. My name is Margaret Carter. I'm 69 years old. A widow. A mother. A grandmother. And until that Thanksgiving, I thought I knew exactly where I belonged in my family. I was wrong. The morning started before sunrise. I woke at 5:30, the same way I had every Thanksgiving for nearly 40 years. The house was quiet except for the old furnace humming somewhere beneath the floorboards. For a few seconds lying there in bed, I forgot that Richard was gone. My husband had been dead for 4 years, but grief has strange habits. Sometimes it sleeps beside you. Sometimes it waits behind a doorway. Sometimes it disappears for weeks and then returns because of something as simple as a holiday morning. I reached toward the empty side of the bed before catching myself. The sheets were cool. Undisturbed. Reality settled back over me. I got up and started the coffee. The smell filled the kitchen within minutes. Rich and familiar. Comforting. Outside, November sunlight was only beginning to push through the darkness. Inside I had work to do. Lots of it. Thanksgiving had always happened at my house. Not because anyone demanded it. Not anymore. It simply became one of those traditions that survived long after people stopped talking about why. Everyone just expected Grandma Margaret to host. And every year I did. Because family mattered. Or at least I thought it did. By 7 o'clock, the turkey was already in the oven. I rubbed butter beneath the skin exactly the way my mother taught me when I was young. Sage. Rosemary. Thyme. Fresh black pepper. The scent slowly spread through the house. For a moment, standing in front of the oven, I smiled. I could almost hear my grandchildren racing through the hallway. Emma laughing. Tyler arguing with his cousin over football. Michael asking if the turkey was done 3 hours too early. The memories were so vivid that I caught myself looking toward the doorway, expecting someone to walk in. Nobody did. The house remained quiet. I told myself that was normal. People wouldn't arrive until afternoon. There was still plenty of time, so I kept working. By 10 o'clock, the dining room looked beautiful. At least I thought so. The good china sat on the table. The crystal glasses sparkled beneath the light fixture. Orange and gold leaves decorated the centerpiece. I even used the cloth napkins Richard loved. The expensive ones we almost never touched because he was always afraid someone would spill gravy on them. I smiled at the memory. Then I unfolded one napkin and placed it beside the plate at the head of the table. His place. I still said it every year. Not because I expected him to come back. Because some absences deserve to be acknowledged. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked steadily. Its rhythm felt comforting. Predictable. Unlike people. At noon I checked my phone. No messages. That was unusual. Normally there would be texts. Someone running late. Someone asking what side dishes to bring. A grandchild sending a photo. Something. Instead there was nothing. I frowned. Then I dismissed the concern. People were busy. Holidays were hectic. I wasn't going to invent problems where none existed. At least that's what I told myself. Around 1:30 I called Michael. Straight to voicemail. I left a cheerful message. Isuadhart. Just checking in. Everything's ready whenever you all are. Drive safely. I hung up. 5 minutes later I texted him. No response. By 2 o'clock, a small knot had formed in my stomach. The turkey was resting. The mashed potatoes were finished. The pies were cooling. Everything was ready. Everyone was not. I walked from room to room pretending I was looking for things to do. Straightening pillows. Adjusting decorations. Wiping a perfectly clean countertop. Anything to avoid staring at the clock. At 3:30 I stood on the front porch. The neighborhood felt alive. Cars filled driveways. Children played football in nearby yards. Families arrived carrying casserole dishes and desserts. Everywhere I looked people were gathering. Everywhere except my house. The cold air stung my cheeks. I pulled my sweater tighter around my shoulders. Then I went back inside. The silence felt heavier now. The kind of silence that presses against your ears. The kind that makes you hear every creak in an old house, every tick of a clock, every breath. I picked up my phone again. Still nothing. Not a single explanation. Not a single apology. Not a single update. Just silence. And for the first time all day, I felt something that frightened me. Not anger. Not sadness. Doubt. Had I gotten the date wrong? No.
Impossible.
I checked the calendar. Thanksgiving. Exactly where it should be. I checked the family group chat. No new messages. Everything looked normal. Too normal. Almost deliberately normal. As if everyone had agreed not to mention something. The knot in my stomach tightened. I sat down at the dining table. 8 place settings surrounded me. 8 handwritten name cards. Each one carefully prepared the night before. Michael.
Lisa.
Emma. Tyler. The others. I ran my fingers across the cardstock. The edges were smooth. The ink was slightly raised where the pen had pressed into the paper. Such a small thing. Yet suddenly it felt ridiculous. Hours of preparation. Days of planning. Weeks of anticipation. For what? The clock struck 4. Then 5. And that's when everything changed. A notification appeared on my screen. A simple little sound. Nothing dramatic. Just a message arriving in the family group chat. I looked down absent-mindedly. Then I froze. Someone had uploaded a photograph. My family. All of them. Together. Smiling. Laughing. Gathered around a Thanksgiving table. A Thanksgiving table that wasn't mine. And in that moment, sitting alone in a house that still smelled like turkey and cinnamon and everything I had spent my day creating for people who never came, I realized something far worse than being forgotten. I wasn't missing from the photo. I had been removed from it. I stared at the photograph for so long that the screen eventually dimmed. My finger touched the display. The image brightened again. Nothing changed. They were still there. All of them. Michael sat near the center of the table. Lisa stood behind him with one hand resting lightly on his shoulder. Emma smiled toward the camera. Tyler appeared to be laughing at something someone had just said. Even my younger sister Ruth was there. I zoomed in. Then zoomed in again. Not because I didn't believe what I was seeing. Because I desperately wanted to find a reason that would make it hurt less. Maybe it had been taken last year. Maybe it was an old picture. Maybe they had stopped by somewhere before coming to my house. Maybe there was an explanation. The human heart is remarkable that way. When the truth arrives, it often spends a few minutes bargaining with itself. I looked at the timestamp. 14 minutes ago. My chest tightened. Not an old photograph. Not a misunderstanding. Not a memory. It was happening right now. While I sat alone. The comments beneath the picture made it worse. Happy Thanksgiving, everyone. Looks amazing. So grateful for family. Heart emojis. Laughing emojis. A dozen little digital celebrations. Not one person asked where I was. Not one person wrote, "Shouldn't Grandma Margaret be here?" I set my phone face down on the table. The room suddenly felt colder. Not physically. Emotionally. The kind of cold that settles beneath your ribs. The turkey sat untouched at the center of the table. Steam no longer rose from it. The mashed potatoes had started to form a thin skin across the top. The rolls were cooling inside their basket. Everything looked exactly the same. Yet somehow everything had changed. I stood up and walked into the kitchen. For years, when life became overwhelming, I cooked. Not because food solved problems. Because routines did. Peeling potatoes. Measuring ingredients. Washing dishes. Those things made sense. People often didn't. I picked up a dish towel and wiped down an already clean counter. Then another. Then another. Anything to keep moving. Anything to avoid thinking. It didn't work. The questions kept coming. Why hadn't anyone called? Why hadn't Michael answered? Why hadn't Emma texted? Why had nobody told me? The hardest question came last. How long had they been planning this? I leaned against the sink. Outside the kitchen window, the sky was beginning to darken. The last golden light of afternoon stretched across the backyard. The maple tree Richard planted 20 years ago swayed gently in the wind. I remembered another Thanksgiving. Emma had been 6. She spilled cranberry sauce across my white tablecloth. Lisa apologized for nearly 10 minutes. Emma cried because she thought she had ruined dinner. Richard laughed and told her the stain would become part of family history. By the end of the night, everyone was joking about it. Back then we had felt like a family. Or maybe we simply looked like one. The memory hurt more than the photograph. Because photographs can lie. Memories usually don't. I returned to the dining room and picked up the phone again. This time I examined the image more carefully. Not the people. The details. The background. The decorations. The table. The room. The host. Something felt strange. Then I saw it. The centerpiece. A large arrangement of autumn flowers. Orange roses. White pumpkins. Golden leaves. I had seen it before. Lisa had shown me pictures of it 2 weeks earlier. She'd been deciding between centerpiece designs for what she called a small Friendsgiving event. A small Friendsgiving. That's what she had called it. Not Thanksgiving. Friendsgiving. I remembered the conversation clearly now. I had been standing in the grocery store comparing pie fillings. Lisa had sent me 3 photos. Which one do you like best? I chose the arrangement that now sat in the middle of the table where my entire family was eating without me. A chill traveled through me. Not because of the flowers. Because of what they represented. Planning. Preparation. Intent. That centerpiece hadn't appeared overnight. Neither had the gathering. This wasn't something people decided that morning. Reservations had been made. Food had been purchased. Schedules had been coordinated. People had agreed. People had known. The realization settled over me slowly, like snow accumulating on a rooftop. Quiet. Steady. Impossible to ignore. Everyone at that table had known where they were going today. Everyone except me. I sat down again. This time I wasn't looking at the photograph. I was looking through it, trying to see what existed behind the smiles, trying to understand how a family reaches a point where excluding someone feels normal. My eyes stopped on Michael, my son, 45 years old, the little boy who once refused to attend kindergarten because he thought I might get lonely without him, the teenager who used to call me after every football game, the young man who hugged me after his wedding and thanked me for everything I had done. When had we become strangers? The answer frightened me, because I wasn't sure we had become strangers suddenly. Maybe it happened gradually, one missed phone call at a time, one postponed visit at a time, one holiday at a time. Relationships rarely collapse in dramatic moments. More often they erode. Quietly, patiently, like water wearing away stone. The grandfather clock struck 6. The sound echoed through the empty room. I looked around the house. Every piece of furniture carried a memory. The bookshelf Richard built. The rocking chair where I fed Michael as a baby. The hallway where grandchildren once ran screaming with laughter. For decades this house had been the center of family life. Now it felt like a museum dedicated to a family that no longer existed. I swallowed hard. Tears threatened. I refused them. Not because crying was weakness. Because I wasn't ready. I still didn't understand what had happened. An experience had taught me something important. Pain makes terrible decisions. So I sat quietly, breathing, observing, thinking. The photograph remained open on my phone. A frozen moment. Perfect image. But perfect images often hide imperfect truths. And as I studied it one final time, another detail caught my attention. Emma, my granddaughter, wasn't smiling the way she normally smiled. Most people wouldn't notice. I did. Because I had known her for 16 years. Her smile looked forced, polite, uncomfortable, as if she knew something wasn't right, as if someone had asked her to participate in something she didn't fully understand. I enlarged the photo again. Emma wasn't looking at the camera. She was looking off to the side, toward someone outside the frame, toward something. A strange feeling settled in my chest. Small, persistent, impossible to explain. Instinct. The kind you develop after decades of raising children and watching people carefully. For the first time all day, I stopped asking what had happened and started asking who had made it happen. Because being forgotten was one thing. Being excluded was another. And deep down, I no longer believed this had been an accident. I believed someone had made a choice. I just didn't know who. Yet. I placed the phone beside Richard's empty place setting. Then I looked at the untouched meal. The candles. The name cards. the empty chairs. And for the first time that day I made a decision. I wasn't going to call anyone. Not tonight. I wasn't going to beg for explanations. I wasn't going to demand apologies. I was going to wait. Watch. Listen. Because people reveal far more when they think you've noticed nothing. And as darkness settled outside my windows, one thought remained with me. I didn't think I had been forgotten. I was beginning to suspect I had been replaced. I didn't touch the food for almost an hour after making my decision. The turkey remained in the center of the table. The candles burned lower. The shadows in the room grew longer as daylight disappeared beyond the windows. And I sat there, alone, listening to the grandfather clock count the seconds of a Thanksgiving that had never happened. At some point, the heating system kicked on with a low hum. The familiar sound startled me. Not because it was loud, because it reminded me how quiet everything else had become. No laughter. No football game playing from the living room television. No grandchildren arguing over dessert. No Michael sneaking pieces of turkey before dinner. Nothing. Just silence. I looked down at my phone one more time. The family group chat was still active. Messages continued appearing beneath the photograph. People were complimenting the meal, sharing pictures of desserts, talking about how wonderful the afternoon had been. I stared at the screen, waiting. Not for an apology, not even for an explanation, just acknowledgement. A simple message. Something. Mom, we're sorry. Mom, we should have called. Mom, can we explain? Anything. But no message came. Not from Michael. Not from Lisa. Not from anyone. I set the phone face down and finally stood. The movement felt strangely difficult, as though my body had aged 10 years in a single afternoon. The dining room looked exactly as it had 3 hours earlier. Perfect. Untouched. Almost frozen in time. The sight made my throat tighten. For decades, Thanksgiving dinner had begun with people arriving too early. Someone always forgot something. Someone always brought an extra guest. Someone always tracked leaves through the front hallway. The chaos used to annoy me. Now I would have given anything to hear it again. I picked up Michael's place card first. The white cardstock felt smooth beneath my fingers. His name was written in the careful handwriting Richard used to tease me about. Nobody writes place cards anymore, Maggie. He always laughed when he said it. And every year I ignored him. Because traditions mattered. At least they mattered to me. I slipped Michael's card into the drawer beside the dining room buffet. Then Lisa's. Then Emma's. One by one. Each card disappearing into darkness. By the time I reached the final card, my eyes were burning. I still hadn't cried. But the pressure behind my ribs felt heavier now. The table looked strangely bare without the names. As if evidence of expectation had been removed. I folded the cloth napkins next. Richard's napkin remained for last. I held it a little longer than necessary. The fabric still smelled faintly of lavender from the detergent I always used. 4 years. 4 years since he'd sat at this table. Sometimes grief softens. Sometimes it simply changes shape. Tonight it felt sharp again. Not because I missed my husband. I missed him every day. Tonight I missed having someone who would have noticed. Someone who would have looked at that photograph and immediately understood why it hurt. Someone who would have said, "This isn't right." I swallowed hard and placed his napkin away with the others. The room grew darker. I turned on a lamp. Warm yellow light spilled across the dining room. For a brief moment, everything looked inviting. Again. Then I remembered there was nobody coming. The illusion vanished. I carried the rolls into the kitchen, wrapped them, stored them, then the green beans, then the stuffing, then the cranberry sauce. Each container clicked shut with a small plastic snap. A strangely final sound. As though I were packing away more than leftovers. As though I were packing away expectations. The turkey took longest. I stood over it with the carving knife in my hand. 4 years this had been my favorite part of Thanksgiving. Richard would stand beside me. Michael would hover nearby pretending he wasn't impatient. The grandchildren would sneak into the kitchen hoping for samples. The memory arrived so clearly that I almost smiled. Then I remembered where everyone actually was. The smile disappeared. I carved slowly, methodically, slices falling onto a platter that nobody would eat from tonight. The scent of sage and rosemary filled the kitchen. Hours of effort. Days of planning. Reduced to leftovers. I placed the turkey into storage containers and closed the refrigerator door. The kitchen suddenly felt enormous. Too much space. Too much quiet. I made myself a cup of tea. Chamomile. Richard hated chamomile. Said it tasted like warm grass. The memory slipped into my thoughts unexpectedly. And this time I did smile. A small one. Tired one. But real. Sometimes the dead remain kinder companions than the living. I carried the tea into the living room and sat in my favorite chair. Outside, darkness had fully settled over the neighborhood. Across the street, I could see light glowing through other families' windows. People gathered together. People laughing. People belonging. I looked away. Not because I was jealous. Because I was trying not to become bitter. There is a difference. One poisons the heart. The other simply acknowledges pain. I wrapped both hands around the warm mug. The ceramic heated my palms. Steady. Grounding. Comforting. The phone remained silent on the coffee table. 7 o'clock. Nothing. 8 o'clock. Nothing. 9 o'clock. Still nothing. That was when something inside me shifted. Not dramatically. Not all at once. Quietly. The way seasons change. The way daylight slowly disappears. All afternoon I have been waiting for someone to explain. Waiting for someone to notice. Waiting for someone to remember me. Now I realize something painful. The silence itself was information. People often think betrayal arrives through cruel words. Sometimes it does. But more often it arrives through absence. Through what isn't said. Through calls that never come. Through questions nobody asks. Through empty chairs. Tonight nobody had forgotten to contact me. Nobody had accidentally overlooked me. An entire day had passed. And not one person had checked whether I was okay. I stared at the dark television screen across the room. My reflection stared back. An older woman. Gray hair. Tired eyes. A cardigan draped around narrow shoulders. For a moment I barely recognized her. Not because she looked old. Because she looked lonely. That realization hurt more than the photograph. The photograph showed where my family was. The silence showed where I wasn't. I set the tea down and glanced toward the hallway. The house seemed larger than usual. The walls carried memories everywhere. Michael running through the corridor after Little League games. Emma learning to ride a bicycle in the driveway. Christmas mornings. Birthday parties. School graduations. Decades of life. I had spent years building a home people wanted to return to. Tonight I wasn't sure anyone still did. The thought lingered. Heavy. Uncomfortable. Impossible to ignore. I stood and walked slowly toward the hallway closet. Inside were photo albums. Dozens of them. Thanksgivings. Christmases. Birthdays. Vacations. Entire decades pressed between plastic sleeves. My hand hovered over the stack. Then stopped. Not tonight. I wasn't ready yet. Instead I selected one smaller album from the middle. A Thanksgiving album. The one covering the years after Emma was born. I carried it back to the living room, set it on my lap, and stared at the cover. The worn edges. The faded gold lettering. The fingerprints accumulated over years. Something told me the answers I needed might already be inside. Not answers about today. Answers about everything that came before it. Because for the first time I wasn't asking, why didn't they come? I was asking something much more frightening. Had this been happening for longer than I realized? I opened the album and immediately found myself staring into the smiling faces of a family I wasn't entirely sure I understood anymore. The first photograph was from 12 years ago. Emma couldn't have been more than 4. She stood on a dining chair wearing a paper turkey crown I had helped her make that morning. Her cheeks were round, her smile missing 2 front teeth, and her hands were covered in construction paper glue. I found myself smiling despite everything. Back then, Thanksgiving had felt effortless. Messy. Loud. Alive. The kind of day where nobody cared if the tablecloth got stained because everyone was too busy enjoying each other. I turned the page. Another Thanksgiving. Another year. Another photograph. Richard stood behind me with his hands resting on my shoulders. I remembered exactly when that picture had been taken. Michael had complained that nobody ever photographed the people who actually cooked the meal. Richard laughed. grabbed the camera from Emma, and insisted someone take a picture of us together. I stared at his face for a long moment. Sometimes photographs preserve things memory struggles to hold onto. The way someone smiled, the way they looked at you, the ease between two people who had spent decades building a life together. I traced the edge of the photograph with my finger, then turned the page. And another. And another. First, I wasn't looking for anything. I was simply remembering. The years after Richard retired. The year Emma learned to play the violin. The year Michael deep-fried a turkey and nearly set the driveway on fire. The year snow arrived unusually early. The year we lost my mother. The years blurred together. Life compressed into photographs and faded captions. But somewhere around the 6th or 7th page, a strange feeling settled over me. A small discomfort, barely noticeable at first. I flipped back, then forward, then back again. The feeling remained. Something wasn't right. I couldn't immediately explain why. Only that a pattern seemed to be forming beneath the surface. I looked closer. One photograph showed everyone gathered around the dining table. Michael,
Lisa,
the grandchildren, my sister Ruth, several cousins. Everyone smiling. Everyone visible. Except me. I frowned. Then remembered. I had taken the photograph. Of course. That explained it. I turned the page. Another family picture. Again everyone was there. Again I wasn't. Because I had been behind the camera. Still normal. Still explainable. I turned another page. And another. And another. Then I stopped. Out of 10 photographs from that year, I appeared in only one. The realization caught me off guard. I wasn't hurt by it. Not yet. Just surprised. I kept turning pages. The following year. Same thing. Then the year after that. And the year after that. At some point I sat up straighter in my chair. The album was no longer a collection of memories. It had become evidence. I counted. 23 photographs. I appeared in 4. 21 photographs. I appeared in 3. 17 photographs. I appeared in 2. My chest tightened. Not because I believed anyone had deliberately excluded me from the pictures, but because I suddenly saw myself the way an outsider might. The woman serving food. The woman carrying dishes. The woman refilling drinks. The woman cleaning up afterward. Present. Necessary. Useful. Yet somehow absent from the moments being preserved. I closed the album briefly. The room felt warmer now. The tea beside me had gone cold. Outside, wind brushed against the windows. I listened to it for a moment, then reopened the album. This time I paid attention to something else.
Lisa.
At first, she appeared exactly as I remembered. A young mother. A busy wife. Part of the family. Nothing unusual. But as the years progressed, another pattern emerged. Subtle. Almost invisible. The kind of thing you only notice after looking at dozens of photographs side by side. Lisa moved closer to the center. Every year. Not physically. Socially. She became the organizer. The spokesperson. The planner. The person everyone looked toward. The person standing beside Michael whenever decisions were made. The person directing group photos. Choosing seating arrangements. Organizing activities. Controlling schedules. I thought back to the last several years. When had she started planning Christmas? When had she started coordinating birthdays? When had she become the person everyone contacted first? I couldn't identify a specific moment. That was what made it unsettling. It hadn't happened suddenly. It had happened gradually. Like ivy climbing a wall. By the time you notice it, the structure underneath has already changed. I turned another page. A photograph from 3 years ago. Emma's birthday. Everyone gathered around the cake. Something about the picture triggered a memory. Not the birthday itself. Something else. A conversation. A disappointment. A feeling. I sat very still, trying to catch it, trying to pull it into focus. Then I remembered. That had been the year I arrived late. Except I hadn't actually been late. At least I didn't think I had. I remembered rushing through traffic, feeling embarrassed, apologizing repeatedly, only to discover the party had started nearly an hour earlier than expected. At the time, Lisa had smiled apologetically. "Oh no, didn't Michael tell you we moved it up?" I remembered nodding, accepting the explanation, thinking it was nobody's fault. These things happen. Families get busy. Schedules change. Life moves quickly. Back then I believed it. Tonight I wasn't so sure. I turned another page. A Christmas gathering. A similar memory surfaced. A last-minute schedule change. A text message arriving after everyone else already knew. A dinner reservation I somehow hadn't heard about until the day before. Again and again. Small incidents. Tiny disappointments. Nothing dramatic enough to question. Nothing obvious enough to confront. Yet suddenly they felt connected. Like pieces of a puzzle scattered across years. I leaned back and closed my eyes. The memories continued arriving. A school recital. A weekend trip. A barbecue. A graduation dinner. Each one carried the same uncomfortable theme. I was informed, but often later. I was included, but often differently. I was present, but increasingly at the edges. The realization made me uneasy, not because it proved anything. It didn't. Not yet. Patterns are not proof. Memories are imperfect, and pain has a way of rewriting history if you're not careful. I knew that, which was why I forced myself to stay objective. Still, the questions remained. Had these really been innocent mistakes? Or had I simply chosen the most comfortable explanation each time? The grandfather clock struck 10. The sound echoed through the house. I opened my eyes and stared across the room. The photograph from Thanksgiving was still sitting on my phone. Waiting. Silent. Accusing. For the first time that evening, I looked at Lisa's smiling face in the picture. Not with anger. With curiosity. There is a difference. Anger assumes you already know the truth. Curiosity admits you don't. And I wasn't interested in assumptions. I wanted facts. I wanted understanding. Most of all, I wanted to know when this distance had begun. Because distance rarely appears overnight. Someone builds it. One decision at a time. One omission at a time. One conversation at a time. I glanced down at the open album resting on my lap. At the smiling faces. The celebrations. The traditions. The years. Then my eyes landed on another photograph. One I hadn't noticed before. It was from last Thanksgiving. The year before today. Everyone stood together in front of my dining table. The same table. The same room. The same decorations. The same traditions. And yet something in the image stopped me cold. Everyone was looking at the camera. Everyone except Lisa. Lisa was looking at me. Not smiling. Not laughing. Just watching. As if measuring something. Evaluating something. The expression lasted only a fraction of a second. A moment frozen accidentally by the camera. Maybe it meant nothing. Maybe I was imagining things. But a chill crawled slowly across my skin. Because suddenly I remembered another conversation. One I hadn't thought about in nearly a year. A conversation that, at the time, seemed completely harmless. Now it didn't. I stared at the photograph. Then at Lisa's face. And for the first time since Thanksgiving morning, I felt something stronger than sadness. Suspicion. Not certainty. Not accusation. Just suspicion. And once a question enters your mind, it becomes surprisingly difficult to silence. I closed the album carefully. The old cover settled shut with a soft thud. Then I looked toward the dark window beside my chair. My reflection stared back. Older. Tired. But more awake than it had been that morning. Because I was beginning to understand something important. The Thanksgiving photograph wasn't the beginning of this story. It was simply the first time I had stopped looking away. And somewhere in the back of my mind, one thought refused to leave. Maybe today wasn't an isolated betrayal. Maybe it was the final chapter of something that had been happening for years. And if that was true, I needed to find out when it started. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. For a few seconds lying in bed, I felt almost normal. Then I remembered. The photograph. The empty table. The silence. And the feeling settled over me again. Not grief. Not exactly. More like the lingering ache left behind after a bruise. The house was cold when I stepped into the kitchen. Outside, a pale gray sky hung over the neighborhood. Thanksgiving was over. The holiday lights across the street looked strangely tired in the morning daylight. I started a pot of coffee and stood by the window waiting for it to brew. The maple tree in the backyard had lost nearly all its leaves. Only a few stubborn ones remained, clinging, holding on. The sight felt strangely familiar. I carried my coffee to the dining room. The table was finally bare. No place cards. No centerpiece. No untouched feast. Just an ordinary table again. Yet something about it felt different. Like a stage after the audience has gone home. I sat down and opened the photo album once more. Not because I wanted to. Because I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. The patterns. The small omissions. The memories that suddenly felt different. I had just turned another page when my phone rang. The sound startled me. For one ridiculous second my heart jumped. Michael. Maybe it was Michael. Maybe he'd finally realized what happened. Maybe he wanted to explain. Maybe I looked at the screen. Emma. My granddaughter. I immediately answered. Good morning, sweetheart. There was a brief pause. Then her familiar voice. Grandma. Something about her tone caught my attention. Not sadness. Not exactly. Nervousness. The kind teenagers try very hard to hide. I smiled despite myself. How was Thanksgiving? Another pause. Longer this time. It was okay. Okay. Not great. Not amazing. Not fun. Just okay. Interesting. Emma normally described everything with enthusiasm. Especially family gatherings. I leaned back in my chair. Just okay. She laughed softly. You know how family stuff gets. That answer sounded older than 16. Too old. Too careful. I took a sip of coffee.
I se pouzi do.
Silence settled briefly between us. Not uncomfortable. Just thoughtful. Then Emma cleared her throat. Grandma. Yes. Are you okay? The question landed gently. But it landed. I stared out the dining room window. At the empty backyard. At the cold November morning. At the place where my family should have been yesterday. And suddenly I realized something. This was the first person who had asked. Not Michael. Not Lisa. Not Ruth. Not anyone. Emma. A 16-year-old girl. My throat tightened unexpectedly.
I'm all right, sweetheart.
She didn't answer immediately. Teenagers are observant in ways adults often forget. They notice pauses. Changes in tone. Things left unsaid. Finally she spoke again. You sound tired. I smiled. I probably am. That seemed acceptable enough. We talked for several minutes after that. School. Basketball season. College applications. Normal things. Comforting things. The conversation slowly relaxed. The nervousness faded from her voice. And then it happened. One simple sentence. The kind of sentence that changes everything. The kind nobody realizes is important when they say it. First, Emma was telling me about a project for school. Something involving interviews with family members. Then she laughed. Mom said you probably wouldn't want to do it anyway. I blinked. What? The interview. She sounded confused. Mom said you don't really like being involved in those things anymore. The room suddenly felt very still. I kept my voice calm. What exactly did your mother say? Emma hesitated. Not because she was hiding something, because she was trying to remember. Nothing bad. She rushed to clarify. Just that you like your quiet time now. My stomach tightened. I stared at the coffee mug in front of me. Did she say that recently? Yeah. Emma sounded puzzled by my questions. Like a couple weeks ago. Couple weeks ago. Before Thanksgiving. I felt a small chill. The same chill I'd felt while looking through the photo albums. A feeling that tiny pieces were beginning to connect. Not enough to see the whole picture. Just enough to notice there was one. I chose my next words carefully. Emma, can I ask you something? Sure. What did you think about yesterday? Another pause. This one different. More cautious. I could almost hear her deciding how honest to be. Finally she answered. I thought it was kind of weird. My grip tightened slightly around the phone. Weird how? Well. She exhaled. I thought you were coming. For a moment I forgot to breathe. I looked down at the polished dining table. The same table that had sat empty the day before. The same table I had prepared for 8 people. The same table nobody came to. What made you think that? Emma sounded surprised. Because it's Thanksgiving. She laughed awkwardly. You're always there. A sharp ache moved through my chest. Not because of what she said. Because of how obvious it sounded. You're always there. Yes, I was. Until I wasn't. I kept my voice steady. Then what happened? I don't know. Another pause. I just thought maybe you changed your mind. The room seemed to narrow around me. Every instinct I had developed over nearly 70 years suddenly focused on that sentence. Changed my mind. I hadn't declined. I hadn't canceled. I hadn't refused. Someone had apparently suggested I chose not to attend. The realization arrived quietly. But it arrived. I looked toward the family photograph still open on my phone. The smiles. The gathering. The celebration. And for the first time a question formed clearly in my mind. Not, why wasn't I there? But, who told everyone I didn't want to be? Emma was still talking. Something about school. Something about basketball. But part of my attention had drifted elsewhere. Following that question. Exploring it. Testing it. Trying to understand where it led. Then Emma said something else. Something even more unsettling. Honestly, Grandma, I thought you were upset with us. I closed my eyes. Just for a second. Why would you think that? Because Mom said you wanted some space. The words hit me harder than the photograph had. Not because they were cruel. Because they were specific. Too specific. Space. That wasn't a misunderstanding. That was a narrative. A version of events. A story. And stories don't appear by accident. Someone tells them. I opened my eyes again. The suspicion I'd been trying so hard to keep under control shifted slightly. Still not certainty. Still not proof. But no longer just a feeling. Now there was a fact. A small one. A fragile one. Yet real. Someone had been speaking on my behalf. Without my knowledge. Without my permission. And somehow people believed it. I forced myself to smile into the phone. Well, sweetheart. Thank you for checking on me. Of course. Her voice softened. I love you, Grandma. The words nearly broke me. Because they were sincere. Simple. Uncomplicated. I love you too, Emma. After we hung up, I sat perfectly still. The house remained quiet. The clock ticked steadily. The coffee had gone cold. And for the first time since Thanksgiving morning, I wasn't thinking about being excluded. I was thinking about information. About assumptions. About stories. Because somewhere between the family photographs and Emma's phone call, something had become painfully clear. The people I loved had not all witnessed the same version of events. Someone had been translating me, interpreting me, explaining me, and if I wanted answers, I needed to find out exactly what they had been told. Because the truth, I was beginning to realize, might not be hidden in what happened yesterday. It might be hidden in what everyone believed had happened. After my call with Emma, I didn't move for a long time. The house remained quiet. The grandfather clock continued its steady rhythm. Outside, a delivery truck rolled past the house, its engine fading into the distance. Ordinary sounds.
Ordinari moments.
Yet, nothing felt ordinary anymore. I kept hearing Emma's voice. Mom said you wanted some space. Mom said you don't really like being involved in those things anymore. I thought you changed your mind. Not accusations. Not proof. Just fragments. But fragments matter. Especially when they all point in the same direction. I stood and carried my cold coffee mug to the kitchen sink. The ceramic felt heavy in my hand. Everything felt heavier today. I rinsed the cup and stared out the window above the sink. 4 years earlier, after Richard died, I had promised myself something. I would never become the kind of widow who spent her life dwelling on every slight. I wouldn't become suspicious. I wouldn't assume the worst. I wouldn't force myself into places where I wasn't wanted. For 4 years I had kept that promise. Maybe too well. Because looking back now, I realized how often I had dismissed my own discomfort. How often I had accepted explanations that didn't quite make sense. How often I had chosen peace over clarity. And perhaps that was exactly why I hadn't noticed what was happening. Until now. I walked into the small office Richard had once used for paperwork. Most people probably would have called it a spare bedroom. To me, it was still Richard's office. His old desk remained against the wall. His reading glasses sat in the top drawer. Even now, I couldn't bring myself to move them. I sat down in the desk chair and opened my laptop. The screen glowed to life. For a moment, I wasn't entirely sure what I was looking for. Then I remembered Emma's words. Someone had been speaking for me. The question was, for how long? I opened my email. Thousands of messages appeared. Years of family plans, birthday invitations, holiday schedules, school events, graduations, family group updates, the ordinary digital record of modern family life. I began scrolling. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then I searched a simple word, Christmas. Dozens of results appeared. I opened one from 2 years earlier. Immediately, a memory surfaced. That Christmas had been disappointing. Not terrible, just disappointing. I had arrived at Michael's house expecting dinner at 6. The meal had already started. Everyone had been seated. Everyone except me. At the time, Lisa had apologized. She told me the schedule changed at the last minute. I remembered feeling embarrassed for being late. I remembered apologizing. Now I looked at the email chain more carefully. The original message said 6 o'clock. A second message changed it to 5. The second message had been sent 3 days later. I checked the recipient list. Everyone received it. Everyone except me. I stared at the screen. Coincidence? Possibly. One missing email wasn't proof of anything. I kept going. Graduation dinner. 3 years earlier. The reservation changed. I wasn't copied on the update. Family barbecue. Different location. I learned about it the day before. Emma's middle school concert. The time changed. No one told me. My pulse quickened. Not from anger. From recognition. The strange feeling I had experienced while looking through the photo albums returned. The feeling of seeing a pattern emerge. One event meant nothing. 2 events meant little. But years of the same thing? That was different. I leaned back slowly. The office suddenly felt smaller. The air felt heavier. Outside, a branch scraped lightly against the window. I barely noticed. My attention remained fixed on the screen. One event after another. One omission after another. Always small. Always explainable. Always easy to dismiss. That was what made it so effective. If someone had openly excluded me, I would have noticed immediately. If someone had directly told me I wasn't wanted, there would have been conflict. Instead, the distance had grown through tiny adjustments. Tiny misunderstandings. Tiny mistakes. Each one too small to challenge. Until they accumulated. Until the distance became normal. I closed my eyes. A memory surfaced unexpectedly. 3 summers ago. A family trip to Lake George. I remembered discovering the trip only 2 weeks before they left. At the time, Lisa had smiled and said, "We assumed you wouldn't enjoy all the walking." I had laughed. Accepted it. Moved on. Now that memory felt different. Not cruel. Not dramatic. Just familiar. Too familiar. I opened another email chain. Then another. Then another. The same names appeared repeatedly. Lisa organizing. Lisa coordinating. Lisa updating everyone. Lisa speaking for the group. And increasingly, Lisa speaking for me. Margaret said she's probably busy. Margaret prefers quieter holidays these days. Margaret doesn't like large gatherings anymore. Margaret wanted a relaxing weekend. I stared at the words. My stomach tightened. Not because they were malicious. Because they weren't true. I had never said any of those things. Not once. Yet there they were. Repeated casually. Repeated confidently. Repeated often enough that people probably stopped questioning them. I thought about Emma. I thought about Michael. I thought about the rest of the family. How many times had they heard these explanations? How many times had they accepted them? How many times had they assumed they were helping me by leaving me alone? The possibility made me feel unexpectedly tired. Because manipulation is rarely dramatic. Most of the time, it simply changes how people interpret reality. One conversation at a time. One assumption at a time. One story at a time. I closed the laptop. The room fell silent. A long silence. The kind that follows a realization. I stood and walked toward the hallway. My eyes landed on a framed photograph hanging near the stairs. Michael at age 12, holding a fishing rod, grinning proudly. Richard beside him, one arm around his shoulders. I stopped there, looking at the picture, remembering, Michael wasn't a bad man. That would have been easier. Bad people are simple. Michael was kind, generous, loving in many ways. But he hated conflict. Always had. Even as a child. If two friends argued, Michael tried to please both. If someone raised their voice, he retreated. If there was tension in a room, he rushed to smooth it over. Suddenly another possibility occurred to me. What if Michael believed all of it? What if he genuinely thought I preferred distance? What if he genuinely believed he was respecting my wishes? The thought hurt. Not because it excused anything. Because it felt possible. And if it was true, then the problem was bigger than one Thanksgiving. Bigger than one photograph. It meant entire. Relationships had been quietly reshaped by assumptions. Assumptions I never created. Assumptions I never corrected. I returned to the dining room. The winter sunlight had shifted. Long shadows stretched across the floor. The same floor I had polished before Thanksgiving. The same room that had stood empty. I looked at the head of the table. Richard's chair. My chair. The places where we had sat for decades. And suddenly I understood something. The Thanksgiving photograph wasn't evidence of a single betrayal. It was evidence of something much older. Something slower. Something far more dangerous. A story had been written about me. A story in which I preferred solitude. A story in which I no longer wanted involvement. A story in which I was slowly stepping away from family life. The tragedy was that everyone seemed to believe it. Everyone except me. I sat down slowly. The realization settled deep inside my chest. Not anger. Not yet. Just clarity. And clarity can be painful. Because once you see something clearly, you can't unsee it. I glanced toward my phone. A new notification had appeared. A text message. For a brief moment my heart jumped. Maybe Michael. Maybe an apology. Maybe an explanation. I picked up the phone. The message was from Ruth. My sister. Only 6 words. Can we talk tomorrow? Alone. I stared at the screen. Then read it again. My pulse quickened. Because Ruth never asked for private conversations. Not like this. Not without a reason. And for the first time since Thanksgiving morning, I had the distinct feeling that someone else knew something. Something important. Something that might finally explain how I disappeared from my own family without realizing it. The next morning passed slowly. Too slowly. I cleaned the kitchen. Watered the plants in the sunroom. Folded laundry that didn't really need folding. Anything to keep my mind occupied. But no matter what I did, I kept looking at the clock. Waiting for Ruth. My younger sister and I had always been close. Not the kind of sisters who spoke every day. But the kind who understood each other without needing many words. That was why her text message had unsettled me. Can we talk tomorrow? Alone. Not. Can I stop by? Not. How are you doing? Not. Sorry about Thanksgiving. Just 6 words. Short. Direct. Serious. Something about them felt heavy. By 1 o'clock, I had already checked the driveway 3 times. By 2, I had convinced myself I was overthinking everything. At 2:15, her car finally pulled in. I watched through the front window. Ruth climbed out slowly. And immediately I noticed something unusual. She wasn't carrying a casserole dish. Or leftovers. Or flowers. She was carrying a large brown envelope. My stomach tightened. I opened the door before she reached the porch. She smiled when she saw me. But it wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile people wear when they have difficult news. Hey, Maggie. Hey. For a moment we simply looked at each other. Then she stepped forward and hugged me. The embrace lasted longer than usual. Long enough for me to notice. Long enough for me to know. Something was wrong. We moved into the kitchen. I made coffee. She sat at the table. The brown envelope remained in her lap. Neither of us mentioned it. First, we talked about ordinary things. The weather. Her arthritis. The neighbor who kept feeding stray cats. The usual subjects people use when they're avoiding the real conversation. Eventually, Ruth set down her coffee cup. The soft clink against the table seemed unusually loud. Then she sighed. How are you really doing? I looked at her. Really looked at her. She already knew. I could see it in her eyes. The question wasn't curiosity. It was concern. I've had better Thanksgivings. Ruth nodded slowly. I figured. Silence settled between us. Not uncomfortable. Just honest. I stared into my coffee. Did everyone know? The question escaped before I could stop it. Ruth looked down. And that answer was enough. She didn't need to speak. Her reaction told me everything. Everyone knew. Everyone except me. The realization hurt. Even though I already suspected it. Some truths still wound when they're confirmed. Ruth reached across the table. Her hand rested gently on mine. Maggie, I need you to understand something. I waited. Most of us thought you didn't want to come. The room became very quiet. Heard the refrigerator humming. The clock ticking. A car passing outside. Tiny sounds. Sharp sounds. Because my mind had suddenly focused on every detail. What? Ruth swallowed. We thought you chose not to come.
Ich zerrte her.
For several seconds I couldn't find words. Not because I was shocked. Because part of me had already guessed. Emma's phone call. The emails. The assumptions. The story. Now here it was again. Confirmed. Someone had told my family I didn't want to be there. When exactly did people start believing that? Ruth hesitated. That hesitation mattered. Because it meant she had been thinking about the answer before I asked. A while ago. The words landed heavily. A while ago? She nodded. Maybe 2 years. 2 years. I leaned back in my chair. 2 years. Not 2 weeks. Not since Thanksgiving. 2 years. Suddenly every memory from the photo album flashed through my mind. The late invitations. The changed schedules. The missed gatherings. The strange misunderstandings. All of them looked different now. Ruth rubbed her hands together nervously. Something she always did when she felt guilty. I should have said something sooner. I looked up. What do you mean? She exhaled slowly. Then finally opened the brown envelope. Several photographs slid onto the table. Family gatherings. Birthdays. Graduations. Barbecues. At first I didn't understand. Then I noticed something. I wasn't in most of them. Not physically absent. Absent entirely. Not even mentioned. Not expected. Not included. Ruth pointed to one photograph. Emma's 14th birthday. I remembered missing that party. Lisa had told me the celebration was being postponed. I attended the following weekend. A smaller gathering. Just immediate family. At the time it seemed reasonable. Now Ruth spoke quietly. The main party happened on the original date.
Ich zerrte her.
What? She nodded. The date was never changed. My pulse quickened. The room suddenly felt warm. Too warm. I looked at the photograph again. Michael was there. Emma was there. Everyone was there. Everyone except me. I remembered standing in my kitchen that day, believing plans had changed, believing there had been a misunderstanding, believing nobody was at fault. And now I was looking at evidence that suggested otherwise. A chill crawled across my skin. Who told everyone I knew about the change? Ruth's expression darkened. For the first time since arriving, she seemed genuinely uncomfortable. Lisa. The name hung in the air. Neither of us spoke. The silence stretched. Heavy. Thoughtful. I wasn't angry. Not yet. I was still trying to understand. Still trying to fit all the pieces together. Because one incident could be explained. Even two. But the pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Ruth picked up another photograph. A Christmas gathering. 3 years ago. I remembered arriving late. Feeling embarrassed. Apologizing. Again. Ruth looked directly at me. Lisa told everyone you weren't feeling well. I frowned. I wasn't sick. I know. The room seemed to tilt slightly. Not dramatically. Just enough to make me grip the edge of the table. How many times? How many conversations? How many explanations? How many versions of me had been shared without my knowledge? I looked toward the dining room. Toward the empty table where Thanksgiving dinner should have happened. And for the first time a painful possibility emerged. Maybe I hadn't been disappearing from my family. Maybe someone had been erasing me. Slowly, patiently, carefully, one event at a time, one explanation at a time, one story at a time. Ruth's eyes filled with regret. Maggie. I looked back at her. I thought people were drifting away. My voice sounded distant. Even to me. I thought maybe I was getting older. Less interesting. Less important. Ruth shook her head immediately. No. The certainty in her voice surprised me. No, Maggie. She reached across the table again. You were never the one pulling away. I felt something shift inside me. Not relief. Not vindication. Something deeper. Something sadder. Because if Ruth was right, then everything I believed about the last few years might be wrong. And if everything was wrong, then I wasn't dealing with one bad Thanksgiving. I was uncovering something much bigger. Something that had been hiding in plain sight for a very long time. And judging by the look on my sister's face, she still hadn't told me the worst part. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The photographs remained scattered across the kitchen table between us. Tiny snapshots of birthdays, Christmas dinners, graduations, ordinary family moments. Moments I had either missed completely or attended under circumstances that suddenly seemed very different from what I remembered. Outside, the wind rattled the bare branches of the maple tree. The sound scraped softly against the windows. Inside, the silence felt heavier. Not hostile. Not uncomfortable. Just full. Full of things neither of us had said for years. Ruth stared into her coffee, then sighed. I owe you an apology. I looked up. What for? Her eyes filled with regret. For staying quiet. The answer didn't surprise me. I had already sensed it. But hearing it aloud still hurt. I waited. Ruth folded her hands together. The way she always did when she was nervous. At first, I thought it wasn't my place. I said nothing. Then after a while, she looked away. I wasn't sure what was true anymore. That caught my attention. What do you mean? Ruth hesitated, searching for words. You know how convincing some people can be when they repeat something often enough. A strange feeling settled in my chest, because I already knew who she meant.
Lisa.
Ruth continued. The first few times it happened, it sounded reasonable. I listened carefully. She'd say things like. Ruth paused, trying to remember. Margaret's tired these days. Margaret doesn't enjoy crowds anymore. Margaret wants more quiet time. Margaret said she might skip this one. Every sentence landed like a small stone. Not devastating individually, but together they formed something heavier. Something deliberate. I stared at the photographs. None of that was true. I know that now. The now mattered. It implied there had been a time when she wasn't sure. A time when enough doubt existed for people to accept the explanation. And that realization was painful. Not because I blamed Ruth. Because I understood exactly how it could happen. Most lies aren't believed because they're outrageous. Most lies are believed because they're plausible. And if someone looked at my life from the outside, a widow, living alone, almost 70, quiet, independent, it wasn't difficult to imagine me preferring solitude. The story worked because parts of it were true, just not the important parts. Ruth reached into the brown envelope again. This time she removed something smaller. A folded sheet of paper, yellowed slightly with age. I frowned. What's that? Her expression changed. A mixture of guilt and hesitation. This is why I wanted to talk to you. A strange uneasiness moved through me. Ruth unfolded the paper carefully, then slid it across the table. I looked down. At first I didn't recognize it. Then I did. A guest list. A Thanksgiving guest list. 3 years old. My handwriting covered part of the page. The sight startled me. Where did you get this? Ruth didn't answer immediately. Instead she asked a question. Do you remember the dinner at Michael's house 3 years ago? I searched my memory. Slowly. Pieces returned. A Sunday dinner. Nothing special. Or at least that's what I thought. I remember being there. Ruth nodded. Do you remember leaving early? The question stopped me. I frowned. Leaving early. Yes. Now that she mentioned it, I did remember. Not clearly. Just fragments. A headache. feeling uncomfortable, going home sooner than expected. At the time it hadn't seemed important, but suddenly the memory felt sharper, more significant. I think so. Ruth leaned forward. Maggie, that's the night everything changed. A chill traveled through me. What are you talking about? She took a deep breath, then finally said it. That's the night Lisa started telling people you wanted less involvement with the family. The room seemed to shrink. The words echoed in my head. 3 years. 3 years. Not months. Not weeks. Years.
Is ter daher.
Why? Ruth shook her head. I don't know. Then she paused. No. Her expression darkened. Actually, I think I do. I waited. Ruth glanced toward the dining room, toward the empty table, then back at me. You remember how much family life revolved around you? The question surprised me. I suppose. You organized everything. She counted on her fingers. Birthdays, holidays, school events, family reunions, baby showers, Christmas, Thanksgiving. I listened quietly, because she wasn't wrong. For decades I had been the one making everything happen, not because anyone asked, because I loved doing it. Ruth continued. Then Richard died. My chest tightened slightly. Even after 4 years, hearing his name still carried weight. And after Richard died, you were still the center. I frowned. I wasn't trying to be. I know. She smiled sadly. That's the point. The realization began forming before she finished speaking. Slowly, uncomfortably, Ruth continued. People still called you first. People still gathered at your house. People still looked to you for decisions. I looked down at the table. A memory surfaced. One I hadn't thought about in years. The dinner. The one Ruth mentioned. The night I left early. And suddenly I remembered something else. A conversation. Brief. Forgettable. Or so I had believed. I had been helping clear dishes. Lisa was standing beside me. We were alone in the kitchen. For only a minute. Maybe less. At the time she smiled and said, You know, Margaret, someday you should let the younger generation take over. I remembered laughing. Actually laughing. Because it sounded harmless. Reasonable. Even kind. I remembered my exact response. Maybe one day. Then we moved on. The conversation disappeared into the thousands of small interactions families have every year. Until now. Now it felt different. Now it felt like the beginning of something. I looked at Ruth and saw from her expression that she had arrived at the same conclusion. That's when it started, isn't it? She nodded slowly. I think so. Neither of us spoke. Because neither of us wanted to say what we were both thinking. Eventually I did anyway. She wasn't trying to take over Thanksgiving. Ruth's eyes met mine. No. I swallowed. She was trying to take over the family. The words hung between us. Heavy. Unpleasant. Yet strangely logical. Not through confrontation. Not through cruelty. Not through dramatic fights. Through influence. Through information. Through perception. Through stories. One small adjustment at a time. One small assumption at a time. Until people stopped checking with me directly. Until people accepted what they were told. Until my absence felt normal. The realization made my stomach turn. Not because it was dramatic. Because it was subtle. Subtle things are harder to fight. Harder to prove. Harder to notice. Ruth looked exhausted. As though she had been carrying this realization for a long time. I should have said something sooner. I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. No. She looked surprised. I smiled sadly. If you were confused, imagine how confused everyone else was. Including me. Especially me. Because the hardest part wasn't discovering someone may have manipulated the situation. The hardest part was realizing how willing I had been to explain everything away. How eager I had been to believe every misunderstanding. Every scheduling conflict. Every excuse. I sat back in my chair. The pieces were beginning to fit. Not perfectly. Not completely. But enough to reveal the outline of something larger. Something intentional. And for the first time since Thanksgiving morning, I understood something important. The photograph wasn't the betrayal. The photograph was the mistake. The mistake that exposed years of quiet manipulation. The mistake that finally forced me to look. Ruth gathered the photographs, the envelope, the papers. But before she could put them away, something caught my eye. A photograph near the bottom of the stack. One I hadn't seen before.
Lisa.
Michael. Emma. A family barbecue from last summer. Ordinary at first glance. Then I noticed who had taken the picture. Me. I remember because I wasn't in it. And suddenly another realization struck. In dozens of family photographs over recent years, I wasn't just missing. I was the one behind the camera. Present. Useful. Necessary. Yet increasingly invisible. I stared at the image. And a new question formed. One even more troubling than the others. If Lisa had spent years quietly changing how the family saw me, how much of Michael's behavior was actually his own? And how much had been shaped by the story he'd been hearing? For years. That question followed me long after Ruth left. Because for the first time, I wasn't just investigating a Thanksgiving. I was investigating the slow disappearance of my place inside my own family. And somewhere deep down, I had the feeling that Michael was hiding something too. Not out of malice. Out of fear. And fear has a way of keeping people silent far longer than it should. 3 days passed before Michael came to see me. 3 days. 72 hours. That may not sound like much. But after spending nearly 7 decades raising someone, you notice things. You notice how quickly they call when they need help. You notice how quickly they call when their car breaks down. You notice how quickly they call when they need a babysitter, advice, money, or reassurance. And you notice how long they wait when they know they've done something wrong. 3 days. That number stayed with me. Not because I was counting, because I couldn't stop noticing. The morning he arrived was cold and overcast. The kind of November day where the sky looks unfinished. I was in the backyard trimming dead branches from a rose bush Richard had planted years earlier. Most people would have removed the bush after he died. I never could. Every spring it still bloomed. Not as beautifully as before, but enough. Enough to remind me that some things survive even when neglected. I heard tires crunching against the driveway gravel. I looked up. Michael's SUV. For a moment my heart reacted before my mind did. That's what motherhood does. No matter how old your children become, part of you still hopes. Still believes. Still wants to see them walking toward you. Then I remembered Thanksgiving. The empty table. The photograph. The silence. My heart settled back into reality. I wiped my hands on my gardening gloves and watched him climb out of the vehicle. He looked tired. Older than 45. His shoulders seemed heavier than usual. He stood beside the driver's door for a second before approaching the house. Almost as if he was rehearsing something. That detail caught my attention immediately. Michael was never comfortable with difficult conversations. Even as a child. If he broke a lamp, he'd spend an hour building courage before admitting it. If he got a bad grade, he'd leave the report card on the kitchen counter and disappear. Conflict exhausted him. Always had. I met him on the porch. Mom. We hugged. Briefly. Politely. Nothing about it felt natural. Not anymore. Can I come in? Of course. The house smelled faintly of coffee and cinnamon. The lingering scent of Thanksgiving still hadn't completely disappeared. I wondered if he noticed. If he remembered. If it bothered him. We settled into the kitchen. The same table where Ruth had sat 3 days earlier. The same table where pieces of my family's story were slowly being rearranged. I poured coffee. Michael thanked me. Then silence arrived.
A familiar silence.
The silence of someone who came with a purpose but didn't know how to begin. Finally, I helped him. What brings you here? He looked down into his coffee. Just checking on you. The answer sounded rehearsed. Too smooth. Too simple. I waited. Eventually he looked up. You doing okay? There it was. The question. Late. Very late. But technically present. I nodded.
I'm managing.
Another silence. Michael tapped his fingers lightly against the mug. A habit he'd inherited from Richard. For a brief second the similarity hurt. Then he cleared his throat. Emma said she talked to you. Interesting. Not. I wanted to talk about Thanksgiving. Not, I owe you an apology. Not, can we discuss what happened? Instead, Emma said she talked to you. I leaned back slightly. She did. Michael nodded. His eyes drifted toward the window. Away from me. Away from the conversation. Away from the truth. The same way they had done his entire life whenever he felt uncomfortable. She was worried about you. I smiled faintly. She was the only one. The words landed harder than I intended. Michael flinched. Just slightly. But I saw it. A guilty reaction. Small. Immediate. Honest. Good. Honest reactions reveal more than prepared speeches. I should have called. There it was. The closest thing to an apology so far. I waited. The explanation never came. Instead, he stared into his coffee again. I found that fascinating. Because people who are innocent usually explain. People carrying guilt usually stop after admitting just enough. The distinction matters. I was surprised not to hear from you. His jaw tightened. I know. Another interesting answer. Not I forgot. Not I was busy. Not I thought Lisa called. Just I know. The room fell quiet again. Outside, wind moved through the trees. Inside, the clock ticked steadily. I let the silence work. People rushed to fill silence. Especially nervous people. Especially Michael. Eventually he did exactly what I expected. Lisa feels terrible. The sentence nearly made me laugh. Not because it was funny. Because it was predictable. For the first time since arriving, he spoke with confidence. Not when discussing his own actions. Not when discussing mine. When discussing Lisa. That told me everything. I kept my expression neutral. Does she? Yeah. He nodded quickly. She thought there was a misunderstanding. There it was. The word. Misunderstanding. The favorite shelter of people who don't want to examine what actually happened. I stirred my coffee slowly, watching the cream swirl. Then I asked a simple question. What misunderstanding? Michael blinked. His mouth opened, then closed. The answer should have been easy. If there was a misunderstanding, surely he could explain it. Instead, several seconds passed. Long enough to become noticeable. Finally he spoke. Well. Another pause. She thought you weren't coming. I looked at him carefully. Very carefully. Why would she think that? His eyes immediately dropped. There it was. The first crack. Small. But real. Because Michael already knew the answer. Or at least part of it. He just didn't want to say it. The silence stretched. And suddenly I remembered something Ruth had said. People believed the story because it sounded reasonable. I decided to test something. Michael. He looked up. When was the first time you heard that I didn't want to come? His expression changed instantly. Not dramatically. Just enough. Enough for a mother to notice. Enough for someone who had watched this boy grow into a man. Enough for someone who had spent 45 years reading his face. Because he wasn't searching for the answer. He was choosing one. And those are very different things. I don't know. A lie. A small one. But a lie. I knew it. He knew it. The room knew it. I nodded slowly, as though I accepted the answer. Then I asked another question. One even simpler. One that changed everything. If Lisa thought I wasn't coming. I paused. Why did I spend 2 weeks preparing Thanksgiving dinner? Michael froze. Not physically. Emotionally. His entire expression stalled. The way a computer freezes before shutting down. Because suddenly he had a problem. A contradiction. A very obvious contradiction. If everyone believed I wasn't attending Thanksgiving elsewhere, then why had I been preparing a full Thanksgiving meal at my house? A meal Michael himself knew about. A meal we had discussed. A meal he had confirmed. I watched realization spread across his face. Slowly. Painfully. And in that moment I understood something important. My son wasn't here to explain what happened. My son was here because for the first time, he had started realizing that parts of the story no longer made sense. And that realization frightened him. As if the story didn't make sense. Then he would have to ask himself a question he had spent years avoiding. What if his mother hadn't been pulling away from the family? What if someone had simply convinced him she was? And judging by the look on his face, that possibility had finally started keeping him awake at night. For several seconds Michael said nothing. He simply stared at his coffee. The steam had long disappeared, but he kept looking at the mug as though it might somehow provide answers. I didn't rush him. At my age, you learn something important. People reveal more when they aren't interrupted, especially when they're struggling with a truth they've spent years avoiding. The kitchen remained quiet. Outside, the wind rattled the branches of the maple tree. Inside, the clock continued its steady ticking. Eventually, Michael sighed. A tired sound. The sound of someone carrying something heavier than he wants to admit. I know you were preparing. His voice was barely above a whisper. I nodded. Then why did everyone believe I wasn't coming? His jaw tightened. Again, that same reaction. The reaction of someone approaching a truth they don't want to face. I don't know. This time the answer sounded weaker, less certain, because even he no longer believed it. I folded my hands on the table, calmly, patiently, not because I wasn't hurt, because anger would only make him retreat. Fear had already kept him silent long enough. I wasn't going to help it. Michael. He looked up. When was the first time you heard that I wanted space? His eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, in concentration. For the first time, he seemed genuinely interested in the question himself. His gaze drifted toward the window, toward the backyard, toward somewhere far beyond both. Searching memory. And then I saw it. Recognition. Small, but unmistakable. A memory surfacing. Actually. He stopped. I waited. Actually, it might have been last spring. My stomach tightened. Last spring. Months before Thanksgiving. Months before the photograph. Months before Emma's phone call. Months before any of this. What happened? Michael rubbed the back of his neck. The gesture instantly transported me 20 years into the past. He always did that when he felt uncomfortable, even as a teenager. I don't know if it matters. The moment those words left his mouth, I knew it mattered. People only say that when something matters very much. Tell me anyway. He hesitated, then nodded. It was after Emma's choir concert. I remembered the concert. Barely. Not because of the performance. Because I hadn't attended. At least I hadn't thought I could. I frowned. I thought I was out of town that weekend. Michael looked confused. No. My heart skipped. No. He shook his head. Lisa said you didn't want to come. The room became very still. I stared at him. Every instinct in my body suddenly alert. Every memory sharpening. She said what? Michael frowned, as if hearing the words aloud made them sound strange. She said large school events made you tired. I blinked. Once. Twice. Trying to process what I had just heard. Because I remembered that weekend. Clearly. I had been home. Very much home. I had spent most of Saturday planting tulip bulbs in the backyard. I remember because it rained. And because Emma had sent me a picture of her choir uniform. I had asked what time the concert started. The answer never came. At the time I assumed she got busy. Teenagers do that. Now my chest tightened. Because suddenly the memory looked different. Very different. I never said that. Michael swallowed. I know. The answer surprised both of us. I could see it. The certainty in his voice had arrived before he was ready. Before he could stop it. Before he could retreat behind another excuse. For the first time all afternoon, he wasn't defending anyone. He was simply stating a fact. I never said that. And he knew it. The realization hung between us. Heavy. Unavoidable. I leaned back slowly. The pieces continued shifting. Aligning. Connecting. A story that once seemed confusing was beginning to reveal its structure. Not completely. But enough. Enough to recognize the pattern. Enough to recognize the author. Michael stared at the table. Then suddenly laughed. A short, uncomfortable laugh. What? He shook his head. I just remembered something. The tone in his voice changed. Not amusement. Disbelief. The kind people experience when old memories suddenly take on new meaning. What did you remember? He rubbed his forehead. Last summer. I remained silent. Waiting. Lisa told me you didn't want to go to Emma's regional basketball tournament. My pulse quickened. The tournament. I remembered that too. Or rather, I remembered missing it. At the time Emma told me afterward, I had felt disappointed, but I assumed the schedule changed. Or maybe I misunderstood. There had always been an explanation. Always. Michael continued. I believed it. The admission sounded painful. I didn't even ask you. The room felt smaller. Not physically. Emotionally. The truth was narrowing around us. Removing escape routes. Removing convenient misunderstandings. Removing doubt. I looked at my son. Really looked at him. And for the first time since he arrived, I saw something beyond guilt. Shame. Not dramatic shame. Quiet shame. The kind that arrives when someone realizes they ignored something they should have questioned. How many times? The question escaped before I could stop it. Michael looked up. What? How many times did someone tell you I didn't want to come? His expression fell. Because he already knew he couldn't answer. Not accurately. Not anymore. The number had become too large. Too ordinary. Too normalized. He stared toward the dining room. Toward the table. Toward the empty space where Thanksgiving should have happened. Then finally spoke. More than I can remember. The honesty hurt. But honesty often does. I nodded slowly. Because I had reached the same conclusion myself. This wasn't one event. It wasn't Thanksgiving. It wasn't Christmas. It wasn't Emma's concert. It wasn't the birthday party. It was years. Years of assumptions. Years of interpretations. Years of someone speaking for me. Until eventually people stopped checking. Until eventually the story became reality. Michael sat silently for a long moment. Then he asked a question that surprised me. Mom. Yes. Why didn't you ever say anything? The question landed softly. Not accusatory. Genuine. I considered it carefully. Because I had asked myself the same thing. Many times over the last few days. Finally I answered. Because every incident felt too small. His eyes remained fixed on mine. I continued. One missed event isn't a crisis. He nodded. A late invitation isn't a crisis. Another nod. A misunderstanding isn't a crisis. Silence. Then I smiled sadly. But enough small things eventually become a very large thing. The words seemed to settle deeply inside him. Perhaps because they explained more than Thanksgiving. Perhaps because they explained the last few years. Neither of us spoke for a while. The kitchen filled with quiet. Not uncomfortable this time. Reflective. The kind of silence that follows recognition. Finally Michael stood. Walked toward the window. Looked outside. His shoulders looked heavier than when he arrived. Older somehow. As if certainty had been carrying him. And now certainty was gone. When he spoke again his voice sounded different. Less defensive. More thoughtful. Maybe I've been hearing one version of things for too long. The statement wasn't dramatic. But it mattered. Because for the first time he wasn't talking about Thanksgiving. He wasn't talking about mistakes. He wasn't talking about misunderstandings. He was talking about perspective. About narratives. About stories. And stories are powerful. Especially when repeated often enough. Michael turned toward me. A troubled expression crossing his face. There's something else. My stomach tightened. What? He hesitated. Long enough to make me nervous. Then he said 6 words that changed everything. Emma asked me about it too. I stared at him. What do you mean? Michael exhaled slowly. After Thanksgiving. His voice dropped. She asked why Grandma wasn't there. The room went silent. Because suddenly I understood. Emma had noticed. Not just the absence. The inconsistency. The contradiction. The same contradiction now troubling Michael. And if Emma was asking questions, then perhaps the story was starting to crack. Not because anyone exposed it. Because reality no longer matched it. And reality has a way of winning eventually. No matter how long people avoid it. As Michael prepared to leave, I found myself thinking about something Ruth had said. You weren't the one pulling away. At the time I wasn't sure I believed her. Now I wasn't so sure she was wrong. Because for the first time, someone besides me was beginning to question the story. And once people start questioning a story, they often begin looking for the person who wrote it. 2 days after Michael's visit, I was standing in my kitchen making banana bread when the doorbell rang. It was nearly 3 in the afternoon. A cold December rain tapped softly against the windows, the kind of rain that seemed determined to stay all day. I wiped flour from my hands and glanced toward the front door. I wasn't expecting anyone. For a brief moment, I wondered if it might be Michael again. Or Ruth. Instead, when I opened the door, I found Emma standing on my porch. Alone. Her backpack hung from one shoulder. Her dark hair was damp from the rain. And judging by the expression on her face, she hadn't come for a casual visit. Emma. She gave me a small smile.
Grandma.
A feeling stirred inside me immediately. Instinct. The kind grandparents develop after years of watching children grow. Something was bothering her. Something important. I stepped aside.
Come in, sweetheart.
The warmth of the house wrapped around us as she entered. She removed her shoes automatically, a habit I'd spent years teaching her. Some traditions survive. Others don't. I took her wet jacket and hung it by the door. Do your parents know you're here? Emma nodded. I told Dad. Interesting. Not I told Mom and Dad. Just I told Dad. A tiny detail. But details mattered more to me these days. We moved into the kitchen. The scent of banana bread filled the room. Emma immediately smiled. Amazing. That's what happens when you visit your grandmother unexpectedly. She laughed softly. The sound eased some of the tension. Not all of it. Just enough. I poured her a glass of milk. The same way I had when she was 6. Somewhere between childhood and adulthood, certain rituals remain comforting. Emma sat at the kitchen table, then wrapped both hands around the glass. Not drinking, just holding it. Another sign she was nervous. I sat across from her, waiting. Eventually she spoke. Grandma. Then stopped. I waited. Can I ask you something? Of course. She stared down at the table. If I tell you something. Her voice dropped. Will you be mad? The question caught me off guard. Mad at you? She nodded. I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. Never. That wasn't entirely true. Maybe someday she would do something worthy of anger. But not today. Not this. Not whatever burden had brought her here. Emma took a breath. Then another. Finally she spoke. I don't think Thanksgiving happened the way everyone says it did. The room went very still. The grandfather clock ticked in the next room. Rain tapped against the windows. Somewhere inside the oven, the banana bread continued baking. Normal sounds. Ordinary sounds. Yet suddenly everything felt sharper. Focused. I kept my voice calm. What makes you say that? Emma looked relieved. As though she'd been afraid I wouldn't believe her. I heard something. My pulse quickened. Not dramatically. Just enough. What did you hear? She looked. Toward the doorway. Then back at me. The way people do when sharing something they aren't supposed to know. It was before Thanksgiving. I remained silent. Encouraging. Listening. Mom was talking to Aunt Rachel. My sister Rachel. The detail immediately grabbed my attention. Emma continued. They didn't know I was upstairs. A chill crept slowly through me. Because accidental conversations often reveal what deliberate conversations hide. What were they talking about? Emma swallowed. Then looked directly at me. You. The word landed softly. Yet somehow it felt heavier than anything else. I folded my hands together. Carefully. Patiently. What exactly did they say? Emma frowned. Trying to remember. I don't remember every word. That's okay. But. She hesitated. Then continued. I remember Aunt Rachel asking if you were coming. I felt my stomach tighten. Rachel had asked. Good. That meant at least one person hadn't automatically assumed I was absent. What did your mother say? Emma's expression shifted. A mixture of uncertainty and discomfort. Because even now she wasn't entirely sure what the conversation meant. Mom laughed. I blinked. Laughed. Emma nodded slowly. Just a little. The image disturbed me more than I expected. Not because laughter is cruel. Because it suggested confidence. Confidence in something already decided. Emma continued. Then she said. Another pause. Longer this time. I could see her replaying the memory. Searching for exact words. Finally she found them. Don't worry. Margaret won't be a problem. The room seemed to lose all sound. For a second, even the rain disappeared. All I could hear was that sentence. Margaret won't be a problem. Not Margaret isn't coming. Not Margaret has other plans. Not Margaret declined. Problem. I kept my face neutral. Years of motherhood had taught me that children stop talking when adults react too quickly. Inside, however, something shifted. A small piece. Another piece. Joining all the others. Emma watched me carefully. Does that mean something? I chose my words slowly. It might. Her shoulders relaxed slightly, as though she'd been carrying the memory alone. There was something else. Of course there was. There always is. I nodded. Go ahead. Emma looked down at her glass. Mom said people only notice things if you make them notice. The sentence hit me harder than the first, because it sounded deliberate, calculated, not emotional, not impulsive, strategic. The kind of thing someone says when they understand influence. The kind of thing someone says when they believe perception matters more than reality. I stared at the kitchen window, at the rain sliding down the glass, at the gray world beyond, and for the first time since Thanksgiving I felt something approaching certainty. Not complete certainty, but close. Close enough to recognize that the story I'd been uncovering wasn't built from misunderstandings. It had structure, intent, direction. Emma shifted in her chair. Grandma. Yes. Am I making too much of this? The question broke my heart a little, because she sounded exactly like I had sounded for years. Questioning herself. Doubting herself. Wondering if she was imagining patterns. Wondering if she was overreacting. I reached across the table again, this time holding her hand firmly. No. Her eyes met mine. No, sweetheart. I smiled gently. You're paying attention. The relief on her face was immediate, visible, real. And in that moment I realized something important. Emma wasn't just bringing me information. She was becoming the first person in the family willing to trust what she saw instead of what she was told. That mattered. More than she understood. Because stories survive when nobody questions them. The moment people start asking questions, everything changes. And judging by the look in Emma's eyes, she had many more questions than answers. So did I. But for the first time I wasn't searching alone. And that made all the difference. For several minutes after Emma finished speaking, neither of us said much. The banana bread timer eventually beeped. The sound startled both of us. Almost comically, as though we'd forgotten the rest of the world still existed. I stood and removed the loaf from the oven. The scent of warm banana and cinnamon immediately filled the kitchen. Normally, Emma would have been asking for the first slice before it even cooled. Today she remained quiet, thoughtful, watching me, watching my reaction. I understood why. Children, no matter how old they get, often feel responsible for the emotions of the adults they love, especially when they bring uncomfortable truths. I set the loaf on a cooling rack and turned back toward the table. Emma was staring into her glass of milk, lost in thought. Then suddenly she looked up. Oh, the single syllable immediately caught my attention. What is it? Her eyebrows pulled together, the way they always did when she was trying to remember something important. I forgot something. A strange feeling moved through me. Not fear, anticipation. Because every conversation over the past week seemed to uncover another piece of the puzzle. What did you forget? Emma looked toward the ceiling briefly, searching her memory. Then her eyes returned to mine. There was one more thing Mom said. The room seemed to narrow. Just slightly. Enough. I sat down again. Waiting. Listening. Emma frowned. I didn't think it mattered before. My pulse quickened. Tell me anyway. She nodded. Then took a deep breath. It was after Aunt Rachel asked if you were coming. I felt my stomach tighten. The same conversation. The same one where Lisa had said, Margaret won't be a problem. Already troubling enough. But apparently not finished. Emma continued. Aunt Rachel said something like. She paused, trying to reconstruct the exchange. Maybe someone should double-check with her. The sentence hung in the air. I could picture Rachel saying it. Practical. Reasonable. Rachel had always been that way. Not confrontational, but cautious. The kind of person who wanted confirmation before making assumptions. I waited. Emma swallowed, then finally spoke the words. The 4 words. The 4 words that stayed with me long after she left. Leave it as is.
Ister her.
What? Emma nodded. That's what Mom said. The kitchen suddenly felt colder. Not physically. Emotionally. Leave it as is. Not. She already knows. Not. She said she wasn't coming. Not. I'll call her later. Leave it as is. A sentence only makes sense if action is being deliberately avoided. A sentence only makes sense if clarification is unwanted. A sentence only makes sense if uncertainty benefits someone. I looked away for a moment, toward the rain-covered window, toward the gray afternoon beyond, toward nothing at all, because suddenly I wasn't thinking about Thanksgiving. I was thinking about intent. Until now, I had tried very hard to remain fair. Very hard. I had considered misunderstandings, communication problems, family assumptions, human mistakes, all the ordinary explanations people reach for when they don't want to believe something darker. But this felt different. If Rachel suggested confirming plans, and Lisa intentionally prevented that confirmation, then Thanksgiving hadn't happened because of confusion. It had happened because confusion was preserved, protected, maintained. The realization settled slowly inside me. Heavy, unwelcome, yet increasingly difficult to deny. Emma watched me carefully. What does it mean? The question was simple. The answer wasn't. I considered it for a moment, then chose honesty. It means someone didn't want questions asked. Emma's eyes widened slightly. I could see the same realization beginning to form inside her. The same uncomfortable possibility. Not certainty, but possibility. And sometimes possibility is enough to change everything. She sat quietly for a few moments, then spoke again. Much softer this time. There was something weird after Thanksgiving too. I looked up immediately. What happened? Emma shifted in her chair. Nervous again. Mom got mad. That surprised me. Lisa didn't get mad often. At least not openly. People like Lisa understood the value of composure. The value of appearances. The value of looking reasonable. What was she mad about? Emma looked uncomfortable. Asking questions. The answer landed harder than I expected. Because it fit. Perfectly. Whose questions? My questions. The room fell silent. I waited. Emma continued. I asked why you weren't there. Another pause. Then I asked if you'd been invited. I felt my heartbeat quicken. How did she respond? Emma gave a small shrug. But it wasn't a casual shrug. It was the shrug of someone still bothered by the memory. She told me I was creating drama. There it was. Another familiar tactic. Not answer the question. Question the person asking it. I recognized it immediately. Most people do. They just don't always realize what they're seeing. Then she said families have enough problems without people stirring things up. I leaned back slowly. The pattern was becoming unmistakable now. Questions discouraged. Clarifications avoided. Assumptions encouraged. Alternative explanations supplied. A narrative maintained. Not through force. Through repetition. Through convenience. Through silence. Emma looked troubled. Is that bad? I smiled sadly. No. Her forehead wrinkled. No. No, sweetheart. I reached across the table. Questions aren't bad. The tension in her shoulders eased slightly. I continued. Questions are how people find the truth. The words seemed to stay with her. I hoped they would. Because if the past week had taught me anything, it was this. Families don't fall apart because someone asks difficult questions. Families fall apart when nobody does. The rain outside had finally started slowing. The gray clouds were beginning to break apart. Thin strips of sunlight appeared beyond them. Weak, but visible. Emma eventually stood to leave. I walked her to the front door. The driveway glistened from the rain. The world looked washed clean. Fresh somehow. Before stepping outside, she turned toward me. Grandma. Yes. She hesitated. Then asked the question I had secretly been asking myself all week. Do you think Mom did it on purpose? I looked at my granddaughter. At her worried eyes. At her uncertainty. at the innocence still remaining despite everything. And I realized something. I wasn't ready to answer that question. Not yet, because intention is complicated. People rarely see themselves as villains, even when they're causing harm. So I smiled gently and told her the truth. I think we're still finding out what happened. Emma nodded slowly, satisfied, or at least willing to wait. Then she hugged me, tightly, the way she used to when she was little. And after she left, I stood on the porch watching her walk toward the car. Strange. Feeling settled over me. Not sadness. Not anger. Clarity. For the first time since Thanksgiving, I stopped wondering whether I had imagined everything. I hadn't. Something real had happened. Something deliberate. The only remaining question was why. And deep down, I suspected the answer had less to do with Thanksgiving than with something much older. Something Lisa wanted. Something she had been building toward for years. As I turned back toward the house, my phone buzzed. A text message. From Rachel. Only one sentence. I think it's time I tell you what happened at Christmas 2 years ago. I stared at the screen. My pulse quickened. Because whatever came next, it sounded like another piece of the story. And perhaps one much bigger than Thanksgiving. Rachel called that evening. Not a text. Not an email. A phone call. That alone told me whatever she wanted to say wasn't small. I was sitting in the living room when the phone rang. The Christmas tree stood in the corner. Still undecorated. Normally by early December, it would already be covered in lights. For years, decorating it had been one of my favorite traditions. This year, I hadn't felt much enthusiasm. Not after Thanksgiving. Not after everything I was beginning to learn. The phone vibrated again. Rachel. I answered immediately. Margaret. Something about her voice made me sit up straighter. Nervous. Careful. The way people sound when they're carrying information they aren't sure how to deliver. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Rachel sighed. I almost didn't call. That wasn't encouraging. Why? Because I should have said something a long time ago. The words sounded familiar. Ruth had said almost the exact same thing. I stared at the dark television screen across the room. My reflection stared back. Waiting. Listening. Rachel continued. Do you remember Christmas Eve 2 years ago? Immediately a memory surfaced. Not a happy one. Not entirely. That Christmas had always felt strange. At the time I couldn't explain why. Now I suspected I was about to find out. I remember. Do you remember arriving late? I frowned. The same question again. Another event. Another schedule. Issue. Another memory suddenly under investigation. Yes. At least I thought I did. That was what I'd been told. Rachel was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that made my stomach tighten. You weren't late. The room seemed to go still. Not physically. Emotionally. I closed my eyes. The memory returned. Christmas Eve. Snow falling outside. The smell of cinnamon candles. Children running through the house. And me arriving after dinner had already started. I remembered apologizing. Repeatedly. I remembered feeling embarrassed. I remembered Lisa telling me the dinner time had changed. I remembered everyone acting as though the explanation made sense. And now Rachel was telling me none of it was true. I opened my eyes again. What happened? Rachel exhaled slowly, then finally answered. The dinner never changed. The words landed like a stone. Heavy. Solid. Impossible to ignore. I felt my pulse quicken. Then why was I told it did? Silence. Not because Rachel didn't know. Because she did. And we both knew where this conversation was heading. Eventually she spoke. Lisa told everyone she'd informed you. There it was again. The same pattern. The same structure. The same mechanism. Lisa said she told me. Everyone believed her. No one checked. No one asked. And I ended up sitting alone in my car outside a Christmas gathering wondering why I was late. I remembered that feeling now. The embarrassment. The confusion. The way Michael had hugged me and said, "Don't worry, Mom. These things happen." At the time I appreciated his kindness. Now it felt different. Because nobody had bothered to verify the story. Rachel continued. I remember thinking it was odd. I listened carefully. Why? Because you always arrive early. The answer almost made me laugh. Not because it was funny, because it was so obvious. 40 years. 40 years of hosting holidays. 40 years of preparing meals. 40 years of arriving before everyone else. And somehow nobody questioned why I would suddenly arrive 90 minutes late to Christmas dinner. Except Rachel. The realization hurt. Not because she noticed. Because so few others did. Rachel's voice softened. Margaret, can I tell you something honestly? Of course. I don't think anyone wanted to believe anything was wrong. That sentence stayed with me. Because it explained so much. People prefer comfortable stories. Comfortable stories require less effort, less conflict, less responsibility. Felisa said she called me. Then everyone could relax. No problem.
No tensión.
No difficult questions. Just move on. And that's exactly what they did.
He said quietly.
Thinking. Remembering. Then another memory surfaced unexpectedly. A Christmas photograph. One I'd seen in the album. Everyone gathered around the tree. Everyone smiling. Everyone together. Except me. At the time I assumed I was taking the picture. Now I realized something else. That photograph had been taken before I arrived. The family Christmas portrait existed. I simply wasn't in it. The realization struck deeper than I expected. Not because of the picture itself. Because of what it represented. Memories. Records. History. The story a family tells about itself. And in that story I had slowly begun disappearing. Not dramatically. Quietly. One image at a time. One gathering at a time. One explanation at a time. Rachel interrupted my thoughts. There was something else. Of course there was. There always was. Every conversation lately seemed to uncover another hidden layer. What? I asked quietly. Rachel hesitated. Long enough to make me nervous. Then she continued. The Christmas situation wasn't what worried me. My grip tightened around the phone. What did? Rachel sighed. The conversation afterward. A chill moved through me. What conversation? I already knew. Some part of me already knew. Still I needed to hear it. Rachel's voice dropped. As people were cleaning up, your name came up. I sat perfectly still. The Christmas tree lights reflected softly against the window. Outside, darkness had fully settled over the neighborhood. Inside, I felt something very different settling. Understanding. Slow. Unwelcome. Necessary. What was said? Rachel hesitated one final time. Then answered. Someone asked whether we should wait for you before taking family photos. The room went silent. Because suddenly I knew. I knew. Exactly where this was going. I knew before she finished. And somehow that made it worse. Rachel continued. Lisa said. She stopped. Then spoke carefully. As though repeating the words still made her uncomfortable. At some point families have to move forward. I stared into the darkness. Unable to speak. Unable to move. Because those weren't the words of someone organizing a holiday. Those were the words of someone redefining a family. And for the first time since Thanksgiving, I began wondering whether this had ever been about logistics at all. Or whether it had always been about something much bigger. Something far more personal. Something that started long before the empty Thanksgiving table. Something that started the moment someone decided my role in the family was becoming optional. For several seconds after Rachel repeated Lisa's words, neither of us spoke. At some point, families have to move forward. The sentence lingered in the silence. It wasn't openly cruel. That was the unsettling part. If Lisa had insulted me, I would have recognized it immediately. If she had demanded I stay away, someone would have objected. But this was different. The statement sounded reasonable on the surface, even thoughtful, until you looked beneath it, until you asked the obvious question. Move forward from what? And why did moving forward seem to require leaving me behind? I stared at the Christmas tree in the corner of my living room. Still undecorated. Still waiting. The lights reflected faintly in the window. Outside, darkness pressed against the glass. Inside, I suddenly felt very tired. Not physically. Emotionally. The kind of exhaustion that comes when years of confusion begin rearranging themselves into clarity. Finally, I found my voice. What happened after she said that? Rachel exhaled. A long breath. As though she had been carrying the memory for years. Someone challenged her. My attention sharpened immediately. Who? Uncle David. I blinked. My mother's younger brother. 81 years old. Retired machinist. Stubborn as granite. The kind of man who never cared whether people liked what he had to say. A small smile touched my lips despite everything. Of course it had been David. Rachel laughed softly. That's exactly what I thought. The memory seemed to lighten her expression slightly. Nobody expected him to say anything. But he did. I could practically hear Uncle David's voice already. Slow. Direct. Impossible to intimidate. What did he say? Rachel didn't answer immediately. Instead, I heard her shifting on the other end of the line, settling into the memory. Then she spoke. He looked at Lisa and asked one question. I waited. Move forward from what? The exact question I had just asked. I closed my eyes. Of course he had. Rachel continued. The room got quiet. I imagined it. The family gathered in the living room. Wrapping paper. Christmas music. Half-finished desserts. And suddenly an uncomfortable truth sitting in the middle of everything. Nobody likes those moments. Most people rush to escape them. Lisa apparently tried. What did she say? Rachel hesitated, then answered. She laughed. The response didn't surprise me anymore. Laughter. Deflection. Redirection. I was beginning to recognize the pattern. Then she said you weren't as interested in family events anymore.
A familiar sentence.
One I'd never actually said. Yet somehow everyone had heard. Again and again. Rachel continued. David asked if you told her that directly. My pulse quickened. The answer mattered. Not because I didn't know it. Because I wanted to know what Lisa said. Rachel's silence lasted several seconds. Then finally, she said she could tell. The room became very still. I stared into the darkness, trying to absorb those words. I could tell. Not Margaret told me. Not Margaret explained. Not Margaret asked for distance. Just I could tell. An assumption, presented as fact, repeated often enough to become truth. I suddenly remembered dozens of conversations from the last few years. Conversations where people told me what I wanted, what I needed, what I preferred, without ever asking. And for the first time I realized how dangerous that could become. Rachel interrupted my thoughts. David wasn't convinced. That didn't surprise me either. Uncle David had spent 80 years distrusting assumptions. What happened? He told her something. I waited. Rachel smiled faintly. You know David? Yes, I did. His exact words were. Another pause. Then, if you want to know what Margaret thinks, ask Margaret. The sentence hit me harder than I expected. Simple, obvious, reasonable, yet apparently revolutionary. Because somewhere along the way, people had stopped doing exactly that. Stopped asking me. Stopped checking with me. Stopped hearing my voice directly. Instead, they accepted interpretations, summaries, assumptions, convenient explanations. Rachel continued. Nobody knew what to say after that. I could imagine why. Because David had exposed something fundamental. Not a lie. Not exactly. Process. A habit. A way of thinking, one that had slowly replaced direct communication. And once you see that process, it's difficult to ignore. What did Lisa do? Rachel sighed. She changed the subject. Of course she did. Not aggressively. Not dramatically. Just smoothly. The way people do when a conversation is moving somewhere they don't want it to go. I stood and walked toward the window. Snow flurries had begun drifting through the darkness. Tiny white flecks. Almost invisible against the night sky. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Rachel said something unexpected. Margaret. Yes. I don't think it started because Lisa hated you. The statement caught me off guard. Because if someone had asked me a week ago, I would have insisted Lisa didn't hate me. Even now, I wasn't sure hatred was the right word. What do you think it was? Rachel took her time answering. When she finally did, her voice sounded thoughtful. Almost reluctant. I think she wanted to matter. The words settled slowly. Not immediately. Because they weren't what I expected. Rachel continued. When she married Michael, you were the center of everything. I remained silent, listening. People called you first. People came to your house. People asked your opinion. People depended on you. The truth of it made me uncomfortable. Not because it was wrong, because I had never thought about it that way. I wasn't trying to be the center. I was simply doing what I'd always done. Showing up. Helping. Organizing. Caring. But influence doesn't disappear just because you don't acknowledge it. Rachel continued softly. And I think Lisa wanted that role. I looked out at the falling snow, thinking, remembering, trying to be fair, trying not to jump to conclusions. Yet memories kept surfacing. Small moments, little comments, subtle frustrations. Times when Lisa seemed irritated that people asked me instead of her. Times when she volunteered to organize events. Times when she quietly took control of traditions. Not all at once. Gradually. Patiently. Over years. Like someone inheriting a position before the previous person realized it was changing hands. Rachel's voice softened. I don't think she wanted to remove you overnight. A chill moved through me. Because I knew exactly what she meant. No. Not overnight. That would have caused resistance. Questions. Conflict. Instead it happened slowly. Slow enough to feel natural. Slow enough to avoid attention. Slow enough that even I didn't notice. Until Thanksgiving. Until the photograph. Until the empty table. The final result wasn't one act of exclusion. It was years of quiet repositioning. Years of moving me closer to the edges. Years of making my absence feel ordinary. I closed my eyes briefly. Then asked the question that had been forming in my mind all evening. Do you think Michael knows? Rachel didn't answer immediately. That alone told me a great deal. Eventually she sighed. I think Michael knows pieces. The answer felt true. Painfully true. Not enough awareness to stop it. Not enough courage to challenge it. Just enough knowledge to feel uncomfortable. Just enough guilt to avoid looking too closely. Rachel continued. I think your son spent years choosing peace over truth. The sentence landed heavily. Because it described Michael perfectly. Not cruel. Not malicious. Just afraid of conflict. And sometimes fear creates damage every bit as real as intention. After we hung up, I stood by the window for a long time. Watching snow drift through the darkness. Thinking about Thanksgiving. Thinking about Christmas. Thinking about all the years in between. And for the first time since this began, I understood something important. This wasn't a story about one holiday. It wasn't even a story about Lisa. It was a story about what happens when people stop asking questions. When assumptions replace conversations. When convenience replaces honesty. When silence becomes easier than truth. And somewhere in the middle of those years I had slowly become invisible. Not because I disappeared. Because people stopped looking. But now they were starting to look again. And once people start seeing clearly, it's very difficult to return to the old story. The week after my conversation with Rachel, I stopped calling. That may not sound like much. For most people, it probably wouldn't be. But for me, it felt like learning to walk differently after 69 years. Because for as long as I could remember, I had been the one who reached out first. Called birthdays. I checked on illnesses. I reminded people about anniversaries. I organized dinners. I sent holiday cards. I asked how school was going. I remembered appointments. I remembered graduations. I remembered everyone's lives. For decades, I had been the thread connecting everything. Not because anyone asked me to be. Because I loved them. Simple as that. But after Thanksgiving, after the photographs, after Emma, after Ruth, after Rachel, I made a decision. Not out of anger. Not out of revenge. Out of curiosity. I wanted to know something. If I stopped pulling the thread, what would happen? So I stopped. I didn't call Michael. I didn't text Emma. I didn't send reminders. I didn't check in. I simply stepped back. For the first few days it felt unnatural. Almost wrong. Several times I picked up my phone automatically, only to put it down again. Once I even typed out a message to Michael asking how work was going. Then deleted it. Not because I was punishing him. Because I needed to see what happened without my effort holding everything together. That first Monday was quiet. Tuesday too. Wednesday passed. Then Thursday. Nothing. No phone calls. No texts. No emails. No questions.
No invitations.
The silence surprised me. Not because I expected constant attention. Because I had assumed someone would notice. Someone would realize I had disappeared. No one did. Or at least no one acted as though they had. The realization hurt more than I wanted to admit. On Friday afternoon, I found myself standing in the grocery store staring at a display of apples. A ridiculous place to have an emotional crisis. Yet there I was, holding a basket, trying not to cry in the produce section, because suddenly I understood something. For years I had told myself the family was busy. Everyone had jobs, responsibilities, children, lives. That explanation felt generous, kind, reasonable. But standing there among apples and shopping carts, another possibility entered my mind. What if they weren't simply busy? What if I had become part of the background, like wallpaper, always there, always available, always expected, yet rarely noticed? The thought followed me home, and stayed. That evening, instead of sitting alone with my thoughts, I did something unexpected. I accepted an invitation, a real invitation, one that had been sitting unanswered for nearly 2 months. The local community center hosted a weekly dinner for seniors every Friday evening. My neighbor, Helen, had invited me repeatedly. Every week I politely declined. I was too busy, too tired, too focused on family. This week I said yes. Helen nearly dropped her phone. "You're serious?" I laughed. "Apparently. You'll love it." I doubted that, at least initially. The idea of spending Friday night with strangers discussing gardening and arthritis sounded deeply unappealing. Still, at 6 o'clock I found myself walking into the community center carrying a casserole. Old habits die hard. The room was warm, bright, crowded. The scent of coffee and homemade food filled the air. People talked, laughed, shared stories. Nobody knew anything about Thanksgiving. Nobody knew anything about Lisa. Nobody knew anything about family drama. To them, I wasn't Grandma Margaret. I wasn't Mom. I wasn't the family organizer. I wasn't the person who remembered everyone's birthdays. I was simply Margaret, a woman carrying a casserole. And strangely enough, that felt good. Liberating even. Helen introduced me to half the room. Retired teachers, former nurses, veterans, widowers, widows, people who had lived entire lives before I ever met them, people carrying their own stories, their own griefs, their own disappointments. For the first time in weeks I forgot about Thanksgiving. Not completely, just enough. Enough to laugh, enough to listen, enough to enjoy myself. At one point I found myself sitting beside a woman named Clara, 74, sharp as a tack, twice divorced, zero patience for nonsense. Within 10 minutes she had somehow learned more about me than some family members had asked in years. How many children? 1. Grandchildren? 2. You see them often? The question caught me off guard, because I wasn't sure how to answer anymore. Clara must have noticed. She smiled knowingly. Ah. That single syllable carried decades of experience. I laughed despite myself. What does that mean? It means I know that look. I raised an eyebrow. What look? The look women get when they realize they've spent years building their lives around people who never learned how to build theirs around them. The sentence landed harder than she intended. Or perhaps exactly as intended. Either way, it stayed with me. The drive home felt different. The streets were quiet. Christmas lights glowed in windows. The world seemed softer somehow, less centered on what I had lost, more open to what still existed. When I arrived home, there was a message waiting on my phone. My heart jumped automatically, then settled. Michael. The message was brief. Hey Mom. Hope you're doing okay. I stared at the screen. A week ago, that text would have meant everything. Now it raised a question. Was he checking on me? Or responding to my absence? The distinction mattered. I didn't answer immediately. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel obligated to. Instead, I set the phone aside and made myself a cup of tea. The house no longer felt quite as empty. Not because anything had changed. Because I had. A little. The truth was uncomfortable, yet undeniable. For years, my world had grown smaller while my family's world grew larger. I had accepted that arrangement without noticing. Family first. Always. Until suddenly there wasn't enough room left for me. Now, sitting alone in my kitchen with a cup of tea warming my hands, I realized something. The opposite of loneliness isn't company. The opposite of loneliness is belonging. And for the first time in a very long while, I was beginning to wonder whether I had been searching for belonging in the wrong place. Before going to bed, I finally looked at Michael's message again. Then I noticed something else. There was no mention of Thanksgiving. No mention of the photograph. No mention of Lisa. No mention of anything that mattered. Just, hope you're doing okay. I stared at the words for a long moment, then placed the phone face down, because a new question had entered my mind, one that felt even more important than the answers I'd been chasing. If I stopped being useful, who would still come looking for me? The weeks between Thanksgiving and Christmas passed differently than I expected. Not easier, not happier, just different. For the first time in decades, my days weren't organized around other people's schedules. No school pickups. No reminder calls. No coordinating holiday meals. No checking who could make it and who couldn't. The strange thing was that the world didn't fall apart. For years, I'd carried a quiet belief that if I stopped holding things together, everything would unravel. It didn't. Life simply continued. People adjusted. Or perhaps they'd already adjusted long before I realized it. The community center became part of my routine. Friday dinners. Tuesday book club. A Wednesday morning walking group that moved at a pace somewhere between exercise and gossip. The first few times felt awkward, like wearing someone else's shoes. But gradually something shifted. I began looking forward to them. Not because the activities were extraordinary, because nobody expected anything from me beyond my presence. That was new, refreshing, a little sad, and surprisingly healing. One Tuesday afternoon, Clara and I sat drinking coffee after book club. She had become something close to a friend, the kind of friend older people make carefully, slowly, without drama, without obligation. We were discussing a mystery novel when she suddenly asked, "How often does your family call now?" I nearly laughed. The woman had the subtlety of a bulldozer. "Why do you ask?" "Because every time your phone vibrates, you look disappointed before you even check it."
Ist daher.
Then shook my head. "You don't miss much, do you?" "No." She smiled. "I don't." The truth was uncomfortable. Because she was right. Part of me still expected something. Not an apology. Not a grand reconciliation. Just effort. Evidence. A sign that somebody missed me. Unfortunately, evidence was in short supply. Michael sent occasional texts. Short ones. Safe ones. Weather. Work. Holiday traffic. Nothing meaningful. Nothing difficult. Nothing that required courage. I answered politely. Briefly. The conversations felt strangely formal. As if we were acquaintances instead of family. Christmas came and went. For the first time in 40 years, I wasn't responsible for organizing anything. I spent Christmas Eve with Helen's family. There were too many children. Too much noise. Too many cookies. And somehow I enjoyed myself. Not because it replaced my family. Because nobody was pretending. Nobody was managing perceptions. Nobody was quietly deciding who belonged. People simply showed up. And that felt remarkably rare. The day after Christmas, I took down a box of decorations from the attic. The house was quiet. Peaceful. Outside, fresh snow covered the neighborhood. Inside, Christmas music played softly from the radio. I was halfway through wrapping fragile ornaments when my phone rang. The sound echoed through the living room. I glanced at the screen. Michael. I froze. Not from excitement. From instinct. Because mothers know things. Sometimes before they have evidence. Something about the timing felt wrong. Not urgent. Just familiar. The kind of familiar that comes from years of experience. I answered.
Sweetheart.
His voice sounded unusually cheerful. Too cheerful. The way people sound when they're leading up to something. "Hey, Mom." A brief pause. Then, "How was Christmas?" We exchanged the usual pleasantries. The weather. the food, the holiday, everything except what actually mattered. 5 minutes passed, then 10, and still he hadn't mentioned why he called. That told me he wanted something. The question was what? Eventually he arrived there. Not directly. Of course not. Michael never approached difficult subjects directly. Mom. Yes. Do you still have that old guest room set up? I stared at the Christmas ornament in my hand. A small glass angel Richard and I bought 20 years ago. The question immediately triggered something inside me. A warning. Not because the question itself was unreasonable. Because it wasn't random. Nothing is random when people want something. Ido. Another pause. Then. Good. There it was. The confirmation. I set the ornament down carefully. What happened? Michael exhaled. Long tired. The sound of a man preparing to admit something uncomfortable. Tyler's been having a rough time. My grandson. 17 years old. Good kid. Quiet. Sensitive. Far more observant than people realized. I listened. He and Lisa got into an argument. Interesting. Not he and your mother. He and me. Specifically Lisa. Michael continued. It's been a difficult few months. I leaned back slowly. For the first time all conversation we were approaching honesty. What kind of difficult? Silence. Then. He says she controls everything. The words settled heavily between us. I didn't respond immediately. Because I was suddenly remembering something Clara once told me. Patterns rarely stay contained. If someone manipulates one relationship, eventually the behavior appears elsewhere. Michael continued. He's been spending more time alone. I listened. He says nobody listens to him. Another silence. Longer this time. Because I suspect both of us heard the irony. Nobody listens to him. Nobody listens to me. The similarities hung unspoken in the air. Finally Michael cleared his throat. He asked about staying with you for a few days. There it was. The real reason for the call. Not concern. Need. Not checking on me. A request. The first major request since Thanksgiving. I looked around the living room. At the Christmas decorations. The quiet house. The peaceful life I'd slowly begun rebuilding. And I felt something surprising. Not resentment. Perspective. Because a few months ago, I would have said yes before he finished the sentence. Without hesitation. Without thought. Without boundaries. Now I paused. Not to punish anyone. To consider. The difference mattered. Michael immediately noticed. Mom. Yes. You okay? I almost smiled. For years nobody noticed when I needed help. Now everyone noticed when I didn't immediately offer it. Funny how that works. I walked toward the window. Snow drifted softly through the afternoon light. The world looked calm. Balanced. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of disappointing someone. How long? The relief in Michael's voice was immediate. Visible even through the phone. A week maybe. I nodded. A week. Reasonable. Manageable. Human. Not endless. Not assumed. A request instead of an expectation. That distinction mattered. I'll think about it. Silence. Complete silence. Then. You'll think about it? The surprise in his voice told me more than he intended. Because for perhaps the first time in his life, his mother wasn't automatically available. Not unavailable. Just no longer automatic. I smiled sadly. Yes. Another pause. Then a quiet. Okay. After we hung up, I stood by the window for a long time. Thinking. Not about Tyler. I'd probably say yes. Eventually. The boy wasn't the issue. The issue was what the call revealed. It had taken over a month for someone in my family to make a meaningful phone call. And even then, it wasn't because they missed me. It was because they needed me. The realization should have hurt. Instead, it clarified something. A relationship built entirely on usefulness eventually becomes a transaction. And I was beginning to understand the difference between being loved and being relied upon. For most of my life, I thought they were the same thing. Now I wasn't so sure. Tyler arrived the following Saturday. The morning was cold and bright. The kind of winter day where the sunlight looks beautiful but provides almost no warmth. I was standing in the kitchen when his car pulled into the driveway. For a moment, I simply watched through the window. 17 years old. Tall. Too thin. His shoulders slightly hunched. Richard used to call it the teenage posture. The posture of someone carrying more than they're willing to admit. As Tyler climbed out of the car, I noticed something else. He looked relieved. Not excited. Not happy. Relieved. As though arriving at my house felt like stepping out of a storm. That realization bothered me more than I expected. Because no child should feel that way about home. I opened the front door before he reached it.
Sweetheart.
His smile appeared instantly. A genuine smile. Not the polite version people wear for photographs. The real thing.
Grandma.
The hug lasted longer than usual. Long enough for me to notice. Long enough to remind me that affection often says what words cannot. When he finally stepped back, I took his overnight bag. One bag. He shrugged. I travel light. I laughed. You're definitely not related to me. That earned another smile. The first genuine laugh I'd heard from him in months. Inside, the house smelled faintly of cinnamon and coffee. Tyler immediately relaxed. I could see it happening. The lowering of his shoulders. The slower breathing. The subtle shift in posture. People reveal their stress levels more honestly than they realize. Want something to eat? Always. Now that sounded like my grandson. Within 20 minutes, he was seated at the kitchen table demolishing a plate of pancakes. Teenage boys possess an almost supernatural ability to consume food. I watched him eat. Not questioning. Not pushing. Just observing. The way Richard taught me years ago. If you want someone to talk, Maggie, feed them first. He had been right. By the time Tyler finished his third pancake, conversation came more naturally. School. Basketball. College applications. Friends. Normal subjects. Safe subjects. The kind people discuss before approaching more dangerous territory. Eventually he pushed his empty plate aside. Those were amazing. That's because I put love in them. He rolled his eyes. That's not a real ingredient. It is in grandmother recipes. That earned another laugh. Progress. Slow but real. The morning drifted comfortably forward. We decorated part of the Christmas tree. Listened to music. Talked about everything and nothing. Well, it felt wonderfully ordinary. Then something happened. Something small. The kind of thing most people would miss. Tyler was helping me unpack a box of ornaments when he held up a photograph ornament from years ago. One of those clear glass ornaments containing a tiny family picture inside. He stared at it for several seconds, then frowned. What? I asked. Tyler looked confused. You used to host Christmas, right? The question seemed innocent enough. Still, something about it caught my attention. Of course. He blinked. Every year. I smiled. For almost 30 years. His expression changed. Subtly. But enough. Enough to make me set down the ornament in my hand. Why are you asking? Tyler looked embarrassed. As though he suddenly realized he'd said something odd. I don't know. He shrugged. It's just. Another pause. Then. Mom always made it sound like you stopped wanting to do that stuff. The room became very quiet. Not dramatically. Just enough. Enough for my heartbeat to become noticeable. I kept my voice calm. What stuff? Tyler frowned. Family events. There it was again. The story. The same story. Only now I was hearing it from a third generation. Not Michael. Not Emma. Tyler. And somehow that hurt more. Because children don't create family narratives. They inherit them. I sat down slowly. What exactly did you hear? Tyler looked uncertain. Not defensive. Just confused. As though he genuinely didn't understand why the question mattered. Nothing bad. That answer sounded familiar. Emma had said almost the same thing. Like what? He thought for a moment. Then answered. Just that you preferred being alone. I stared at him. The words settled heavily. Preferred being alone. Not abandoned. Not excluded. Not forgotten. Preferred. As though solitude had been my choice. As though every empty holiday had been voluntary. I forced myself to smile. Not because I found it amusing. Because I didn't want Tyler feeling caught in the middle. Did your mother tell you that? He nodded. Mostly. Mostly. An interesting word. Because stories evolve. The more they're repeated, the more people contribute. The more they become accepted fact. I looked. Toward the Christmas tree. Toward the ornaments. Toward decades of family memories hanging from its branches. And suddenly I understood something. The story wasn't just influencing events. It was influencing memory. Influencing identity. Influencing how younger family members understood the family itself. Tyler continued. I honestly thought you liked living by yourself. A sad smile touched my lips. I do like living by myself. His eyebrows lifted. Then. I nodded. That's not the same thing as wanting to be left out. The distinction landed immediately. I could see it. A realization unfolding behind his eyes. The kind teenagers have when adults accidentally reveal something important. Something true. Something nobody explained properly before. Oh, just one word. Yet it carried a surprising amount of understanding. I continued gently. Enjoying peace isn't the same as wanting isolation. Tyler stared at the floor. Thinking. Processing. Then another memory surfaced. Apparently for both of us. You know. He hesitated. I always thought it was weird. My attention sharpened. What was? The Thanksgiving thing. My pulse quickened slightly. Which Thanksgiving thing? He looked genuinely puzzled. As long as I can remember, everyone always acted like you were the one who cared most about holidays. I nodded slowly, because that was true. Then Tyler added. So it never made sense when people said you didn't want to be there. The room seemed to freeze. Not because of the statement. Because of who said it. A 17-year-old boy. Someone who wasn't analyzing family politics. Someone who wasn't investigating patterns. Someone simply noticing a contradiction. And suddenly I realized something important. The story had never been as convincing as people thought. Some people simply chose not to question it. Others were too young to know they should. But the cracks had always been there. And judging by the thoughtful look on Tyler's face, he was starting to see them too. The question was, how many more cracks existed that nobody had talked about yet? That evening after dinner, the house felt warmer than it had in weeks. The Christmas tree lights glowed softly. In the corner, a fire crackled in the living room fireplace. Outside, snow drifted quietly across the neighborhood. For the first time since Thanksgiving, I wasn't thinking about exclusion. At least not constantly. Tyler helped me wash dishes. Another small surprise. Most 17-year-old boys considered loading a dishwasher an act of heroic sacrifice. Tyler simply rolled up his sleeves and got to work. Richard would have liked that. Afterward, we settled in the living room with mugs of hot chocolate. The same mugs I'd used for years. The ones with little snowflakes painted around the rim. Tyler stretched out on the couch. The posture of someone slowly remembering how to relax. I sat in my favorite chair. The same chair where I'd spent so many evenings questioning everything. Tonight felt different. Not better. Just lighter. Then Tyler said something that changed that. Grandma. Yes. He stared at the fire for several seconds. I almost didn't come. The statement surprised me. I remained quiet, letting him continue. Dad asked me to. Interesting. Very interesting. Your dad suggested this? Tyler nodded. Actually. He hesitated, then corrected himself. He insisted. The distinction mattered. I felt my attention sharpen. Because Michael rarely insisted on anything, especially where family conflict was concerned. What made him so determined? Tyler shrugged. First. Then his expression changed. A memory surfacing. Something uncomfortable. Something he'd been debating whether to share. I recognized the look immediately. You don't have to tell me anything you don't want to. His eyes met mine. I know. A long silence followed. Then he spoke. I heard Mom and Dad arguing. The room suddenly felt smaller. The fire continued crackling. The Christmas lights continued glowing. Yet all my attention narrowed to those words. Michael and Lisa arguing. That alone was unusual. Michael avoided arguments the way some people avoid storms. What were they arguing about? Tyler looked down at his mug, turning it slowly between his hands. I don't know everything. That's okay. But Another hesitation. Then, it was after Thanksgiving. My pulse quickened. Not dramatically, just enough. The same feeling I'd experienced so many times over the past few weeks. The feeling that another piece was about to fall into place. Tyler continued. I was upstairs. I wasn't trying to listen. I believed him. Most family secrets aren't uncovered through spying. They're uncovered because people underestimate who can hear them. What did you hear? Tyler swallowed, then answered quietly. Dad asked why you weren't invited. The words landed like a physical blow. Not because they were shocking, because they were specific. Very specific. Not, why didn't Mom come? Not, why wasn't she there? Why wasn't she invited? The distinction mattered. I sat perfectly still, because suddenly everything felt different. Michael knew. At least part of him knew. Part of him had recognized something wasn't right. Part of him had asked the question nobody had asked publicly, the question everyone should have asked. Tyler continued. Mom got angry. That didn't surprise me. What did she say? He frowned, trying to remember. There was a lot of yelling. Not common in Michael's house. Another detail worth noting. Then Tyler's expression shifted. Recognition. Memory. I remember one thing. I waited. She said. Another pause. Then, you agreed to this. The room fell silent. Completely silent. Even the fire seemed quieter. Because those 4 words changed everything. You agreed to this. Not you misunderstood. Not you forgot. Not. It was an accident. You agreed. Agreement requires awareness. Agreement requires discussion. Agreement requires choice. I felt a slow chill move through me. Not because I finally had proof. Because I finally understood the shape of the lie. Someone had made a decision. And Michael had been part of it. Maybe reluctantly. Maybe passively. Maybe fearfully. But part of it nonetheless. I stared into the fire. Watching flames consume a piece of wood. Slowly. Quietly. The way truth consumes excuses. What happened next? My voice sounded calmer than I felt. Tyler shrugged. Dad said he thought things would be different. The sentence hurt more than I expected. 'Cause it sounded exactly like Michael. Hopeful. Passive. Waiting for situations to fix themselves. Waiting for other people to do the difficult work. Waiting instead of acting. I could almost hear him saying it. I thought things would be different. Not I stopped it. Not I called Mom. Not I fixed it. I thought. The language of spectators. Not participants. Tyler looked uncomfortable. I probably shouldn't have heard any of it. No. I smiled sadly. You probably shouldn't have. Another silence settled over us. Softer this time. Reflective. Then Tyler said something I wasn't prepared for. I think Dad feels guilty. The certainty in his voice caught my attention. What makes you say that? He laughed quietly. Because I've known him my whole life. Fair point. Then his expression grew serious again. Every time your name came up after Thanksgiving. He stopped, searching for words. He looked miserable. The image formed immediately in my mind. Michael avoiding eye contact. Michael changing subjects. Michael carrying around a truth he didn't want to examine. A truth that kept getting heavier. I thought about our conversation in my kitchen. The pauses. The contradictions. The discomfort. And suddenly something became clear. Michael hadn't been defending Lisa because he believed she was right. Michael had been defending the story because admitting the truth would force him to confront his own role in it. That realization didn't excuse him, but it explained him. Fear often does. Tyler leaned back against the couch. The tension seemed to leave him all at once, as though sharing the memory had lifted something. Then he asked a question. A simple question. One that lingered long after he spoke. Grandma. Yes. If Dad knew something was wrong. He hesitated, then finished quietly. Why didn't he stop it? I looked at my grandson, at his honest eyes, at the confusion on his face, and I realized he was asking the same question I'd been asking myself. Not just about Thanksgiving, about years. Years of silence. Years of avoidance. Years of choosing comfort over courage. The answer, when it came, felt painfully simple. Because sometimes people are more afraid of conflict than consequences. Tyler considered that, then nodded slowly, as though he understood. Or perhaps as though he wished he didn't. The fire burned lower. The room grew darker. And for the first time since this journey began, I stopped wondering whether Michael knew. He knew enough. Maybe not everything. Maybe not from the beginning. But enough. Enough to ask questions. Enough to feel guilty. Enough to recognize the truth when it finally stood in front of him. The tragedy wasn't that he didn't know. The tragedy was that he knew something was wrong and chose peace anyway. And peace built on silence always comes due eventually. Tonight I had a feeling that Bill was about to arrive. Michael called on a Tuesday morning. Not a text. Not a quick check-in. An actual phone call. The moment I saw his name on the screen, I knew something had changed. Over the previous month, every conversation between us had followed the same pattern. Careful. Measured. Avoidant. We talked around problems instead of through them. Around Thanksgiving. Around Lisa. Around the growing pile of questions neither of us seemed ready to face directly. This felt different. I heard it in his voice immediately. Mom.
Michael.
A pause. Then. Can we meet? My grip tightened slightly around the phone. There was something in his tone. Not fear. Not exactly. Resolve. The kind people find only after they've stopped running from something. Of course. Today. I glanced at the clock. Just after 10. That's fine. Another pause. Then. Can I come alone? The question settled heavily between us. Because for years Michael rarely did anything alone. Not intentionally. Not where family was concerned. There had always been a group. A schedule. A reason. A buffer. Usually Lisa. Especially Lisa. This time there would be no buffer. And that told me everything. Yes. His exhale was almost imperceptible. Yet I heard it. Relief. Thank you. The call ended shortly afterward. Simple. Brief. But when I set the phone down, I found myself staring out the kitchen window for a long time. Because I had a feeling I knew what was coming. Not all of it. Just enough. People reach a certain point when carrying uncomfortable truths. A point where maintaining the lie becomes harder than facing it. Maybe Michael had finally arrived there. Maybe not. Either way, something had changed. And I intended to find out what. The rain had returned by the time he arrived. Thin gray streaks sliding down the windows. The kind of weather that made the entire world feel quieter. Michael stepped inside carrying a manila folder. My eyes landed on it immediately. Interesting. Very interesting. Not flowers. Not an apology gift. Not a casserole. Documents. Evidence. Questions. Something. He noticed me looking. Then looked down at the folder himself. Almost sheepishly. Can we sit? I nodded. The kitchen had become the center of so many important conversations lately. Another one wouldn't hurt. We settled into our usual seats. The same table. The same chairs. The same place where pieces of my family's history had been slowly rearranged. For several seconds Michael simply stared at the folder. His fingers resting on top of it. Not opening it. Just holding it. Finally I spoke. You found something. It wasn't a question. His eyes lifted. Then he nodded. Slowly. I think so. The answer sent a chill through me. Because he sounded uncertain. Not about whether he found something. About whether he wanted it to be true. There is a difference. I waited. Eventually Michael opened the folder. Inside were printed emails. Screenshots. Calendar invitations. Text messages. Dozens of pages. Far more than I expected. Far more than he probably expected too. My pulse quickened. What am I looking at? Michael rubbed a hand across his face. A gesture I had seen countless times growing up. Usually after a mistake. Usually after bad news. Usually after a difficult realization. I started checking. His voice sounded tired. Exhausted even. Checking what? The events. I stared at him. The events. He nodded. Everything. The room suddenly felt very still. Because I knew exactly what he meant. The birthdays. The holidays. The graduations. The dinners. The schedule changes. The missed invitations. The years. Michael slid several papers across the table. I went back 3 years. 3 years. The same timeline Rachel had identified. The same timeline Ruth suspected. The same timeline where everything seemed to shift. My stomach tightened. Michael continued. At first I was trying to prove everyone wrong. That surprised me. Not because I didn't believe him. Because it sounded honest. Painfully honest. I wanted to prove Thanksgiving was a misunderstanding. The words hung in the air. Confession. A wish. Failed hope. What happened? Michael laughed softly. A humorless sound. The evidence didn't cooperate. I looked down at the papers. The first page contained calendar invitations. Some included me. Some didn't. Some had revisions. Updates. Changes. Cancellations. Patterns. My heart began beating faster. Not from anger. Recognition. The kind that arrives when suspicions start becoming facts. Michael pointed toward one highlighted entry. Emma's choir concert. I immediately remembered. The event Lisa claimed I didn't want to attend. Michael's jaw tightened. The original invitation included you. I looked at him. Then back at the paper. Then back again. The original invitation? He nodded. The revised version didn't. The room seemed to shrink. Not dramatically. Just enough. Enough for the truth to become impossible to ignore. Michael slid another page forward. Basketball tournament. Then another. Christmas dinner. Then another. Rachel's anniversary party. My pulse quickened with each one. Because the pattern remained identical. Not every time. Not enough to attract attention. Just enough. Just enough to create distance. Just enough to influence outcomes. Just enough to shape assumptions. One event at a time. One revision at a time. One omission at a time. I stared at the documents. Years of small changes. Years of small exclusions. Years of tiny adjustments. The kind nobody notices individually. The kind that become devastating collectively. Michael looked older than 45. Much older. Like a man carrying the weight of several years all at once. Finally he spoke again. Quietly. Almost to himself. I should have seen it. The sadness in his voice surprised me. Not because he felt guilty. Because he finally understood why. The room remained silent. The rain tapped softly against the windows. The clock ticked steadily. And for the first time since Thanksgiving, neither of us seemed interested in avoiding the truth. The truth was sitting on the table between us. Printed. Highlighted. Documented. Patiently waiting to be acknowledged. Michael looked directly at me. A rare thing lately. His eyes were tired. Red around the edges. Honest. Mom. I waited. When did you start feeling like we didn't want you around? The question caught me completely off guard. Because suddenly we weren't talking about evidence. We weren't talking about Lisa. We weren't talking about schedules. We were talking about pain. Real pain. The human cost hidden beneath all the paperwork. I looked down at the documents. Then out the window. Then back at my son. And for the first time in a very long while, I saw a man who genuinely wanted the answer. Not because it was comfortable. Because he was finally ready to hear it. And something told me that what came next might be harder for him than anything he'd discovered in that folder. For a long moment I didn't answer. Michael's question lingered between us. Heavy. Personal. Dangerous. Not because I didn't know the answer. Because I did. And once spoken aloud, some truths can never be taken back. Outside, rain continued sliding down the kitchen windows. The clock ticked steadily. The folder remained open on the table. Years of evidence spread before us. Yet suddenly none of it seemed as important as the question my son had asked. When did you start feeling like we didn't want you around? I looked at him carefully. Really looked at him. Not the little boy who used to bring me dandelions from the yard. Not the teenager who called me after every football game. Not the young man who cried when Richard walked him down the aisle. The man sitting across from me now. 45 years old. Tired. Ashamed. Finally listening. And for the first time I realized something. This conversation wasn't about proving anything anymore. The evidence had already done that. This conversation was about consequences. The emotional ones. The ones that never appear in emails or calendars. The ones that live inside people. I folded my hands together, then answered. It wasn't Thanksgiving. Michael blinked. What? It wasn't Thanksgiving. My voice remained calm, steady. It wasn't Christmas. I glanced toward the folder. It wasn't the missed invitations. The confusion on his face deepened, then slowly transformed into understanding, because he realized what I was saying. No single event had broken me. Pain rarely works that way. I took a slow breath. It was a Tuesday. The room fell silent. Michael stared at me. A Tuesday. I nodded. I remember it clearly. Because I did. Strangely clearly. Some moments attach themselves to memory for reasons we don't understand until years later. This was one of them. I looked beyond him. Beyond the kitchen. Beyond the rain. Back into the past. It was about 18 months ago. The memory returned with surprising precision. The weather. The smell of coffee. The exact sweater I had been wearing. Everything. I called you. Michael's expression changed immediately. Searching. Trying to remember. I don't remember. I know. The answer came gently. Because that was part of the problem. I remembered. He didn't. I continued. You were driving. A flicker of recognition appeared. Small. Uncertain. I had just finished a doctor's appointment. Now he remembered. I could see it. The realization moving slowly across his face. I continued quietly. The appointment wasn't serious. That mattered. I didn't want him thinking this was about illness. It wasn't. It was routine. I smiled sadly. The kind of appointment older people seem to have every few weeks. Michael lowered his eyes. Listening. Really listening. For perhaps the first time in years. I continued. I called because I wanted to have lunch. The words sounded painfully simple. Because they were. No emergency. No crisis. No request. Just lunch. A mother wanting to spend time with her son. Michael's shoulders tensed. The memory was returning now. I could tell. Mom. I gently raised my hand. Not yet. I needed to finish. You told me you were busy. He closed his eyes. Just briefly. I continued. Which was fine. Because it was. People have lives. Jobs. Responsibilities. I understood that. Always had. Then I asked about the weekend. The room remained silent. Except for the rain. Except for the clock. Except for memory. Michael looked physically uncomfortable now. I remembered exactly why. Because I remembered exactly what happened next. You said you'd check with Lisa. The words landed softly. Yet somehow they seemed louder than anything else. Michael stared at the table. Unable to meet my eyes. I continued anyway. Not to hurt him. To tell the truth. Then you laughed. His head lifted immediately. Confused. I laughed. I nodded. Not at me. That part mattered. You laughed because Lisa was standing beside you. The memory was crystal clear. I could hear his voice. Hear the affection. Hear the automatic nature of it. I'll have to ask the boss. A joke. A harmless joke. At least that's what everyone would have called it. Everyone except me. I smiled sadly. You thought it was funny. Michael swallowed. Hard. I continued. So did she. The silence deepened. Because now he remembered. I could see it. Every detail. Every word. Every moment. The same memory viewed from two completely different perspectives. I looked down at my hands. Older hands now. Hands that had cooked thousands of meals. Wrapped thousands of gifts. Comforted countless tears. Hands that had built a life. Then I looked back at my son. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. My voice remained calm. Almost conversational. Nothing dramatic happened. I shook my head. No argument. No fight. No cruelty. Michael's face looked pale now. Because he understood where this was going. I continued. But after we hung up. My throat tightened slightly. The first crack in my composure all afternoon. I sat in my kitchen and realized something. The room became completely still. I looked directly at him. And finally said it. I wasn't calling my son anymore. Tears immediately filled his eyes. Not mine. His. I continued gently. I was calling a household. The words hurt. Even now. Especially now. Because they were true. I wasn't asking you if you wanted lunch. I smiled sadly. I was applying for approval. Michael lowered his head. The first tear hit the table. Then another. I looked away. Giving him dignity. Giving him space. Because humiliation wasn't my goal. Understanding was. After several moments he finally spoke. His voice rough. Broken. I never meant. I know. And I did. That was the tragedy. I knew. Michael wasn't cruel. That would have been easier. Cruelty has clear edges. Michael was passive. And passive people often cause enormous damage while believing they're keeping peace. I continued softly. That Tuesday wasn't the day I stopped loving you. His shoulders shook. Barely. But I noticed. Mothers notice. It was the day I stopped feeling like I belonged. The confession hung in the room. Simple. Devastating. True. I looked toward the rain-covered window. Toward the gray sky. Toward the years behind us. After that, everything started feeling different. The missed invitations. The schedule changes. The assumptions. The stories. All of it. Not because it started then. Because that was the moment I became capable of seeing it. The moment something inside me stopped believing I automatically had a place. Michael wiped his eyes. Then stared at the folder. At the evidence. At the years. At the consequences. Finally he whispered, "Oh my God." Not because of the emails. Not because of the documents. Not because of Thanksgiving. Because for the first time he understood what all of it had cost. And understanding can be far more painful than discovery. The rain continued falling. The clock continued ticking. The kitchen remained exactly the same. Yet everything felt different. Because the truth was no longer hiding in paperwork. It was sitting between a mother and a son. And neither of us could pretend not to see it anymore. Then Michael said something I never expected to hear. Something that changed the entire direction of the conversation. "Mom." I looked up. His eyes were red. Determined. And for the first time in months completely honest. "I think I know why Lisa did it." The words sent a chill through me. Because suddenly this wasn't about what happened. It was about why. And sometimes motives are far more frightening than actions. For several seconds after Michael spoke, neither of us moved. The rain continued tapping softly against the kitchen windows. The folder remained open between us. The grandfather clock ticked steadily in the next room. Ordinary sounds. Yet nothing felt ordinary anymore. Because after months of confusion, weeks of discovery, and years of silence, we had finally arrived at the question hiding beneath everything else. Why? Not what happened. Not who knew. Not when did it start. Why? Why would someone spend years quietly pushing another person toward the edges of a family? I looked at my son. His expression had changed. The shame was still there. The guilt too. But something else had joined them. Clarity. The kind that arrives when someone stops protecting a story and starts examining it. "What do you mean?" My voice sounded calm. Steadier than I felt. Michael stared at the rain. Not avoiding me. Remembering. "There's something I never told you." A strange chill moved through me. Because those words rarely lead anywhere good. I waited. He rubbed his hands together. A nervous habit from childhood. Then finally spoke. "Do you remember the year after Dad died?" Of course I remembered. Some years leave permanent marks. That year certainly had. Richard's funeral. The endless casseroles. The sympathy cards. The unbearable quiet afterward. The way people slowly returned to their lives while I struggled to figure out what mine looked like without him. I nodded. Michael continued. "It was about 6 months after." The timeline immediately caught my attention. 6 months. Before the Christmas incidents. Before the birthday confusion. Before the invitations started changing. Before everything. Lisa and I had an argument. Interesting. I remained silent, letting him continue. "It was bad." His voice dropped. "We almost separated." That surprised me. Not because marriages don't struggle. Because I had never known. Not even suspected. Michael laughed bitterly. I didn't tell anyone. That sounded exactly like him. Suffer quietly. Avoid conflict. Keep smiling. Pretend everything is fine. I listened. One night she told me something. The tension in the room deepened. I could feel it. Whatever was coming had stayed hidden for years. What did she say? Michael closed his eyes briefly, then answered. She said she felt invisible. The words caught me off guard. Not because they were shocking, because they sounded familiar.
Panfeli familiar.
Invisible. The same word I had used describing Thanksgiving. The same word I had felt sitting alone at that table. For a brief moment, neither of us spoke. Then Michael continued. At first, I didn't understand. He shook his head slowly. I thought she meant work, or motherhood, or stress. Any of the ordinary things people feel invisible about. But that wasn't it. I watched him carefully. The memory clearly still affected him. She said every family event felt like your event. The room fell silent. I stared at him. Not angry. Not defensive. Just listening. Michael continued. She said everyone called you first. Another pause. Everyone asked your opinion. Another. Everyone wanted your approval. His eyes met mine. And nobody noticed her. The words landed heavily. Because I could hear the pain inside them. Not my pain. Hers. For the first time since Thanksgiving, I found myself looking at the story from the other side. Not agreeing. Not excusing. Simply seeing. Michael continued. She said she felt like a guest in her own family. A sad smile touched my lips. The irony nearly took my breath away. Because years later that was exactly how I felt. A guest. Not a mother. Not a grandmother. A guest. The realization sat between us. Uncomfortable. Complicated. Human. I leaned back in my chair. Thinking. Remembering. Trying to be honest. Had Lisa felt that way? Maybe. Possibly. I remembered holidays after she married Michael. People did call me first. People did ask my opinion. People did expect me to organize things. Not because I demanded it. Because that's how things had always been. And perhaps no one noticed what that looked like from her perspective. Michael continued quietly. I told her things would change with time. The sadness in his voice deepened. I thought it was normal adjustment. A new marriage. New family roles. New traditions. Reasonable assumptions. Reasonable mistakes. Then he looked directly at me. And that's when she said something I'll never forget. My pulse quickened. Because I knew. Somehow I knew. This was the moment. The beginning. The first domino. What? Michael swallowed. Hard. Then repeated the words. Exactly. If I don't create my own place in this family, I'll spend the rest of my life standing in Margaret's shadow. The room seemed to freeze. Not because the statement was cruel. Because it was honest. Brutally honest. And honesty is often more disturbing than deception. I stared at the rain sliding down the windows. Thinking. Feeling. Trying to process what I just heard. For the first time I could see the shape of the resentment. Not hatred. Not at first. Resentment. A woman trying to find her place. Trying to matter. Trying to belong. The tragedy wasn't that she felt that way. The tragedy was what she chose to do about it. Michael seemed to reach the same conclusion. His voice cracked slightly. I thought she was just venting. Of course he did. Most people don't recognize warning signs until after the damage is done. I didn't think. He stopped. Then shook his head. No. A bitter laugh escaped him. The truth is I didn't want to think. There it was. Finally. The real confession. Not about Thanksgiving. Not about invitations. About avoidance. Michael had seen pieces for years. But seeing pieces isn't the same as assembling them. Especially when assembling them might destroy the version of reality you're trying to protect. I looked at my son. And suddenly I felt something unexpected. Compassion. Not because he was innocent. Because he was human. Flawed. Fearful. Deeply imperfect. Just like the rest of us. He continued quietly. Every time something happened. The missed events. The schedule changes. The assumptions. The easier explanation was always available. A misunderstanding. A communication issue. Bad timing. busy schedules, normal family complications. The lie succeeded because they never needed to be dramatic, only plausible. Michael stared at the folder, at the years of evidence, then whispered. I kept choosing the explanation that required the least courage. The honesty of that statement filled the room. Heavy, painful, necessary, because sometimes the deepest betrayal isn't active cruelty, as passive surrender. The moment someone knows enough to ask questions but chooses comfort instead. And sitting across from my son, I realized that was what finally broke my heart. Not that he didn't know, that he knew just enough, and looked away. Then Michael lifted his eyes to mine. For the first time all afternoon, there was no hesitation left.
No defensiveness. No excuses.
Only truth. Mom. I waited. His voice was barely above a whisper. I think she stopped trying to belong. The room grew still. She started trying to replace. The words settled over us like falling snow. Quiet. Cold. Impossible to ignore. And for the first time since Thanksgiving, I felt we were finally standing at the edge of the real truth. Not what happened, not how, but why. And that truth was about to change everything. For a long time after Michael spoke, neither of us said anything. The rain had stopped. The house felt strangely quiet. Not the lonely quiet that followed Thanksgiving. A different kind. The quiet that arrives when something important has finally been named. She stopped trying to belong. She started trying to replace. The words lingered between us. I stared at the folder on the table. Years of invitations. Schedule changes. Emails. Messages. Tiny decisions. Tiny omissions. Tiny adjustments. Each one insignificant alone. Together they had reshaped an entire family. Michael rubbed his hands together. The nervous habit returned. There was more. I could feel it. People only become this uncomfortable when they're still carrying something. Finally he spoke. There was one more conversation. My attention sharpened immediately. Not because I wanted another reason to be hurt. Because I wanted the truth. The whole truth. No matter what it cost. When? Last summer. His voice sounded distant. As though he were watching the memory unfold again. We had just come back from Emma's regional tournament. I remembered the tournament. The one I never attended. The one I supposedly wasn't interested in. Michael looked toward the window, avoiding my eyes. Not because he wanted to hide. Because he was ashamed. I couldn't sleep. I waited. So I went downstairs. A pause. Then, Lisa was on the patio. The room seemed to grow smaller. I already knew this wasn't going anywhere good. Talking to someone? Michael nodded. Rachel. Interesting. Very interesting. Rachel again. I remained silent. Listening. Carefully. Michael continued. I don't think she realized I could hear. That detail mattered. People reveal their real thoughts when they believe they have no audience. What did she say? The answer didn't come immediately. Instead, Michael stared at the table, at the folder, at years of consequences. Then finally, they were talking about Thanksgiving. My pulse quickened. Not dramatically, just enough, because suddenly all roads seemed to lead back there. The photograph, the empty table, the gathering, the absence, the moment everything finally became visible. Michael swallowed, then repeated the words exactly as he remembered them. If we keep doing things at Margaret's house, nothing will ever change. The sentence landed heavily, not because it was cruel, because it was calculated, strategic, future-oriented, a plan, not a reaction. I felt my stomach tighten. Michael continued. Rachel asked what she meant. The silence deepened. Then he spoke again. People need new traditions. Another quote. Another piece. Another glimpse into a conversation never meant for me. I stared at the rain-streaked glass, thinking, processing, trying to remain fair. Because part of what Lisa said wasn't wrong. Families do create new traditions. Generations change. Children grow up. Roles evolve. That wasn't the problem. The problem was what came next. Michael's voice dropped, almost a whisper. Then Rachel said. He paused, trying to remember precisely. Margaret's still family. The room went very still. I felt my heartbeat in my chest. Steady. Heavy. Waiting. Michael closed his eyes briefly, then delivered the sentence that changed everything. Exactly. I frowned. What? His eyes opened, filled with regret. That's what Lisa said. The answer didn't make sense. At least not immediately. Then Michael continued, and suddenly it made perfect sense. Exactly. That's why she needs to stop being the center of everything. The words settled over me. Slowly. Not explosive. Not dramatic. Just clear. Painfully clear. For years I had wondered if the exclusions were intentional. If the misunderstandings were accidental. If the omissions were simply poor communication. Now, sitting across from my son, I finally understood. This was never about one event. Never about one holiday. Never about one invitation. It was about influence. About position. About belonging. Somewhere along the way, Lisa decided that in order to have a place in the family, I needed less of one. And once that belief took root, every small decision moved in the same direction. Not enough to attract attention. Not enough to create conflict. Just enough to slowly change the landscape. Like water reshaping stone. One drop at a time. Michael looked exhausted. I should have said something then. I nodded. Yes. The honesty surprised him. I think he expected comfort. Reassurance. Permission. Instead, I gave him truth. Because we were finally there. Finally beyond excuses. Finally beyond avoidance. He lowered his eyes. I know. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. Then I realized something unexpected. I wasn't angry. Not the way I thought I'd be. Not the way television dramas teach us to be. There was no desire to scream. No fantasy of confrontation. No hunger for revenge. Only clarity. And clarity changes things. Because once you understand what happened, you stop wasting energy arguing with reality. I looked around my kitchen. The same kitchen where I'd cooked thousands of meals. Hosted holidays. Wrapped gifts. Helped with homework. Comforted broken hearts. Built a family. And suddenly I understood something that had taken me months to learn. The problem wasn't that I had been excluded. The problem was that I spent years believing my worth depended on being included. That realization felt strangely liberating. Like setting down something heavy. Something I'd been carrying for too long. Michael looked at me carefully. You're not saying much. A faint smile touched my lips. I've been saying things for years. His expression shifted. Confused. Then thoughtful. Then understanding. Because he realized what I meant. The issue had never been my voice. The issue was who listened. I stood and walked toward the window. The clouds were beginning to break apart. Thin sunlight appeared through the gray. Winter sunlight. Pale. Fragile. Beautiful. Behind me, Michael remained silent. Waiting. Finally, he asked the question. The question that mattered more than any evidence. More than any email. More than any Thanksgiving photograph. What happens now? I turned toward him. And for the first time since Thanksgiving, I knew the answer. Not perfectly. Not completely. But enough. Enough to move forward. Now. I smiled gently. Now I stopped trying to earn a place that was already mine. The words surprised both of us. Because they were true. For months I had been searching for proof. Searching for explanations. Searching for validation. Searching for reasons. But my value had never depended on anyone else's recognition. Not Lisa's. Not Michael's. Not the family's. I was still the same woman. The same mother. The same grandmother. The same person. Whether they acknowledged it or not. Michael's eyes filled again. Not with guilt this time. With understanding. Real understanding. The kind that arrives too late to prevent pain. But early enough to change the future. And for the first time since Thanksgiving, I felt something unexpected. Peace. Not because everything was fixed. Because it wasn't. Some wounds remain. Some relationships never fully recover. But peace doesn't require perfection. Only truth. And finally, after all these months, the truth was sitting in the open where everyone could see it. No more stories. No more assumptions. No more interpretations. Just truth. And truth, I've learned, is where healing begins. 1 year later, Thanksgiving arrived again. The date on the calendar caught me by surprise. Not because I had forgotten, because I hadn't spent months dreading it. For most of my life, Thanksgiving had been an event, production, a responsibility, a marathon disguised as a holiday. This year felt different, quieter, simpler, healthier. I woke before sunrise just as I always had. Some habits survive everything. The house was silent. The furnace hummed softly beneath the floorboards. Outside, the neighborhood remained wrapped in darkness. For a few moments I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening, breathing, thinking. 1 year. An entire year since I sat alone at a table prepared for people who never came. 1 year since a photograph changed everything. 1 year since I finally stopped looking away. Strangely, the memory no longer felt sharp. It felt distant. Not forgotten. Integrated. Part of my story now. Not the center of it. I smiled faintly and got out of bed. The kitchen greeted me with familiar comfort. Coffee. Pumpkin spice. Fresh bread dough rising beneath a kitchen towel. The scent immediately wrapped around me. Comforting. Grounding. Mine. For the first time in decades, I wasn't cooking for 20 people. I wasn't coordinating arrival times. I wasn't managing personalities. I wasn't worrying whether everyone would get along. The menu was smaller. The table was smaller. The expectations were smaller. And somehow, the joy felt larger. That realization surprised me. I basted the turkey, checked the pies, arranged flowers in a simple glass vase. Nothing extravagant. Nothing performative. Just beautiful enough. Just enough. A phrase I had spent years resisting. Because for most of my life, enough never seemed sufficient. I always believed love required more. More effort. More sacrifice. More availability. More accommodation. Now I understood something differently. Sometimes love looks like boundaries. Sometimes love looks like peace. Sometimes love looks like a table that isn't overcrowded. At 10 o'clock my phone buzzed. A text message. Michael. I stared at the screen for several seconds before opening it. The relationship between us had changed over the previous year. Not magically. Not perfectly. But honestly. For the first time in a long time, honesty existed between us. The text was simple. Happy Thanksgiving, Mom. Thinking about you today.
No excuses. No guilt. No manipulation.
Just truth. I smiled. Then replied. Happy Thanksgiving, sweetheart. Nothing more. Nothing less. Because healing doesn't require speeches. Consistency matters more. Michael had spent the last year doing something he had never done before. Showing up. Not dramatically. Not publicly. Quietly. Reliably. The way trust is actually rebuilt. One action at a time. One visit at a time. One honest conversation at a time. The damage couldn't be erased. But effort mattered. And effort deserved acknowledgement. I set the phone aside and returned to the kitchen. Outside, the morning sunlight had begun spreading across the neighborhood. Golden. Soft. Peaceful. I carried dishes into the dining room. Then stopped. For a moment I simply stood there. Looking at the table. The same table. The same room. The same house. Yet everything felt different. Last year I had set 8 place settings. This year there were only 5. 5 chairs. 5 plates. 5 glasses. 5 handwritten place cards. Picked one up. Then another. Smiling. Because the names told a story. Not of obligation. Of choice. Helen. Clara. Emma. Tyler. Margaret. No elaborate family gathering. No performance.
No expectations.
Just people who genuinely wanted to be there. People who had shown me that belonging wasn't measured by blood alone. The realization filled me with a quiet gratitude. One I never expected to find after Thanksgiving the year before. The doorbell rang at 11:30. I glanced toward the hallway. Then smiled. Right on time. Helen. Of course. She considered punctuality a moral virtue. I opened the door. And immediately found myself laughing. Helen stood holding 2 pies. Clara stood beside her carrying enough food to feed an army. I told her 1 dish. Helen sighed dramatically. She never listens. Clara shrugged. I was raised properly. Their familiar bickering filled the doorway. Warm. Comfortable. Alive. The kind of energy I once believed existed only inside families. Now I knew better. Connection is connection, no matter where you find it. They entered the house carrying food and opinions in equal quantities. Within minutes, the quiet rooms felt alive, the way homes are supposed to feel. Not because they were full, because they were genuine. The conversations came easily. The laughter came naturally. No one managed perceptions. No one controlled narratives. No one decided who belonged. People simply arrived, exactly as they were. An hour later, another car pulled into the driveway. I looked through the window and felt my chest tighten unexpectedly. Emma. She climbed out carrying a casserole dish. Tyler followed behind her. Both smiling. Both arguing about something. Normal teenage behavior. Beautiful teenage behavior. The kind I never wanted to lose. I opened the door before they reached it. Emma hugged me immediately. Tight. Sincere. Happy Thanksgiving, Grandma. Tyler followed, holding the casserole awkwardly, as though he feared dropping it. Happy Thanksgiving. The house grew louder after that. Fuller. Warmer. Yet not crowded. Not overwhelming. Just right. Exactly right. And for the first time in years I realized I wasn't waiting for anyone else to arrive. Not Michael. Not Lisa. Not anyone. Because everyone who needed to be there was already there. The realization settled softly into my heart. Not triumph. Not revenge. Something better. Acceptance. I looked around the room. At Helen laughing. At Clara telling a story nobody completely believed. At Emma setting the table. At Tyler sneaking food from the kitchen. And suddenly I understood something that had taken me nearly 70 years to learn. Family isn't measured by who shares your last name. Family is measured by who keeps showing up. Who listens. Who stays. Who makes room for you, even when they don't need anything from you. The doorbell rang again. Everyone looked up. I wasn't expecting anyone else. Neither was anyone else. For a moment the room fell silent. Then I walked toward the front door. Curious. Calm. And completely unaware that the person standing on the other side was about to bring the final chapter of this story to my doorstep. For a moment, I simply stood there with my hand on the doorknob. The conversation behind me continued. Laughter. Dishes clinking. Clara insisting someone had stolen one of her dinner rolls. The warm sounds of people enjoying each other's company. The sounds I used to believe could only come from a large family gathering. The doorbell rang again. Whoever it was seemed uncertain. Not impatient. Just hesitant. I opened the door. And there stood Michael. Alone. The cold November wind moved gently around him. His hands were buried deep in his coat pockets. For a brief second, neither of us spoke. A year ago, that silence would have felt awkward, painful, loaded. Now it simply felt honest. Mom. His voice was quiet, almost nervous. I looked past him automatically.
No, Lisa. No elaborate explanations.
No carefully managed appearance. Just my son, standing on my porch. Looking older than he had a year ago, but also somehow lighter, more real.
Michael.
He smiled faintly, the kind of smile people wear when they're unsure whether they're welcome. And that realization touched something inside me. Because once upon a time, Michael had never questioned whether he belonged here. Then again, neither had I. Life changes people. Sometimes painfully, sometimes necessarily. I wasn't sure if I should come. I believed him, because for the first time in a long time, he wasn't trying to control the conversation. He wasn't managing impressions. He wasn't hiding behind convenience. He was simply telling the truth. I stepped aside.
Come in.
The relief that crossed his face lasted less than a second, but I saw it. Mothers always do. He entered quietly. The warmth of the house wrapped around him. Immediately the voices from the dining room carried into the hallway. Then Emma appeared. She froze. Dad. Michael smiled. Hey kid. A moment later Tyler emerged from the kitchen. Then Helen. Then Clara. Within seconds, Michael found himself standing in the middle of a room full of people who genuinely seemed happy to see him.
No tensión.
No performance. Just welcome. And I think that surprised him. Because guilt makes people expect punishment. Life doesn't always work that way. We moved into the dining room together. The table looked beautiful, simple, comfortable, alive. Not because of decorations, because of the people sitting around it. Michael looked at the place settings, then at me. You already started. We were waiting for the turkey. A small smile touched his lips, the same smile Richard used to wear. For a second it almost took my breath away. Not because of grief, because of memory. There are moments when the people we love return to us through others. This was one of them. Michael looked around the room, then back at me. Can I help with anything? The question seemed ordinary, yet it wasn't, because for years, he had arrived expecting things to be done, expecting me to handle everything. Today he arrived asking how he could contribute. Growth rarely announces itself dramatically. Often it appears in small questions. I handed him the carving knife. You can carve the turkey. His eyebrows rose. Really? I laughed. You're 46 years old, Michael. The room joined in. Even him. The tension dissolved instantly. For the next hour something remarkable happened. Nothing.
No confrontation. No dramatic confession.
No public reckoning.
No revenge.
Just Thanksgiving. People eating. Talking. Laughing. Sharing stories. Living. And somehow that felt more meaningful than any dramatic ending I could have imagined. Because real life rarely ends with speeches. It continues through choices. Through behavior. Through who people decide to become after the truth comes out. At one point during dinner, I caught Michael watching the room. Watching Emma laugh. Watching Tyler tell a story. Watching Helen and Clara argue about pie. Watching me. Not with guilt anymore. With gratitude. Eventually he leaned toward me. His voice low enough that only I could hear.
I'm sorry.
3 words. Simple. Unadorned. No excuses attached.
No explanations.
No attempt to reduce responsibility. Just, I'm sorry. I looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. Because I believed him. Not because of the words. Because of the year that came before them. The visits. The conversations. The effort. The consistency. Trust isn't rebuilt through apologies. Trust is rebuilt through behavior. And Michael had finally started understanding that. A little later after dessert, people drifted into the living room. The evening settled into that comfortable stage where nobody wants to leave yet. The fireplace glowed softly. The Christmas tree lights reflected in the windows. Outside, darkness covered the neighborhood. Inside, warmth remained. I found myself standing alone in the dining room for a moment. Just a moment. Looking at the table. The same table. The same house. The same woman. And yet everything had changed. A year earlier, I sat alone in this room staring at a photograph. Wondering what I had done wrong. Wondering why I wasn't enough. Wondering why the people I loved seemed able to move forward without me. Now I finally understood. The problem was never my value. The problem was where I was looking for validation. That lesson cost me more than I wanted to pay. But it was worth learning. I heard footsteps behind me. Emma. She slipped her arm through mine. What are you thinking about? I smiled. The past. She leaned her head against my shoulder. And I looked around the room. At the people laughing in the next room. At the life still unfolding around me. At the peace I never expected to find. Then I answered honestly. I'm thinking about how much energy I spent trying to keep people from leaving. Emma looked up. What changed? I smiled. The answer came easily now. I learned to appreciate the people who stayed. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then Emma squeezed my arm. And together we walked back toward the living room. Toward the laughter. Toward the warmth. Toward the people who chose to be there. That night, after everyone left and the dishes were done, I sat alone at the table one last time. Not lonely. Just alone. There's a difference. The house was quiet again. But it wasn't the painful silence of the previous Thanksgiving. This silence felt peaceful. Earned. I looked at the empty chairs around me. Then smiled. Because I finally understood something. Family isn't the people who sit at your table. Family is the people who make room for you at theirs. Some relationships survived the truth. Some didn't. Some wounds healed. Some remain scars. That's life. That's family. That's love. Messy. Imperfect. Human. But as I turned off the dining room light and headed upstairs, I carried something with me that I hadn't possessed a year earlier. Not certainty. Not control. Not approval. Something far more valuable. My dignity. And once you reclaim that, nobody can take it away again. The END. If you enjoyed Margaret's story, remember this. Growing older does not make you less valuable. The people who truly love you never need to be reminded of your place in their lives. They protect it naturally. And sometimes the greatest act of self-respect is not chasing those who drift away, but recognizing and cherishing those who remain.